You know, there's this really funny question that I sometimes see asked on the internet. It goes something like this: what is the greatest video game of all time? Now, this is a question that's basically impossible to answer, because, well, people are bound to disagree on what the true answer is here, because there technically is no true objective answer to this question, as at the end of the day, saying that something is great is just an opinion, and opinions vary wildly from person to person. And you know what? That's perfectly fine. More importantly, because something's greatness is measured by how different people see it, when people do agree that something is really good, it could almost undeniably be said and unanimously agreed upon that that particular thing is indeed great. Now, when it comes to video games, there have been many games that people have considered to be some of the greatest of all time. There's even a whole Wikipedia page dedicated to just a list of games considered by professional critics and video game magazines to be the greatest. Among these so-called greatest games, there is a particular franchise whose entries appear over and over, and in discussions on what is the best that this industry has to offer, there is no doubt that the Legend of Zelda franchise will be brought up nearly every single time. Zelda has had a consistently good run ever since it started out on the NES back in 1986, and has had barely any flops during the nearly 40 years since its launch. Many of its entries are considered to be some of the greatest video games ever made, with several of them being responsible for reshaping our view on video games as a whole, and as such can be argued to be one of, or if you're willing to go that far, the greatest video game franchise of all time. So naturally, if we were to try and pick out the greatest video game of all time, if there even is such a game, it would surely be somewhere in here. And if I had to give my honest opinion, I believe that out of every entry that this franchise has to offer, and out of every single game that has ever been made, there is only one game that deserves the title of the greatest video game of all time. The Legend of Zelda: Ocarina of Time. First released in Japan on November 21st of 1998 and subsequently released in North America, Europe and Australia on November 23rd, December 11th and December 18th of the same year respectively, Ocarina of Time tells the story of Link, a boy without a fairy, in his quest to become the hero of time and save the world from Ganondorf, the great king of evil. Shortly after its release, Ocarina of Time received universal praise from both critics and fans alike, being the highest rated game on Metacritic with its score of 99, garnering perfect scores from many gaming magazines, with Famitsu giving it a perfect score of 40 out of 40, an incredibly difficult feat only 30 games have ever been able to achieve. A Link to the Past came very close to a perfect score with its near perfect 39 out of 40, but Ocarina of Time was the first game ever to receive a perfect score. Selling over 7.5 million units with its N64 release, Ocarina of Time has shaped many childhoods and adulthoods alike, and even now, over 25 years later, is still regarded as not just one of the most influential, well-crafted and beautifully designed games, but has become almost synonymous with the word video games itself, with it being regarded by many as the single greatest video game of all time. It's safe to say that there will never be another game like Ocarina of Time ever again, and while nowadays this game may seem a bit overrated, there is still a reason why people praise it so highly, and why it is considered to be the greatest video game ever made. And now, 25 years later, I played this game for the first time, with no prior knowledge or nostalgia attached to that experience, to see what makes it so beloved, and if it truly holds up as the masterpiece everyone claims it to be. I recorded all of the footage for this video using the 2022 unofficial source port of Ocarina of Time, Ship of Arcanian, which allows the game to run in widescreen 1080p 60fps as opposed to the 4x3 240p 20fps which the game normally runs at, which will hopefully make this the best viewer experience possible. I also streamed the entirety of my playthrough on Twitch, the VODs of which you can find as a playlist on my channel. They should be up by the time you're watching this video, and you can also check out the Twitch channel itself if you're interested in tuning in for the Majora's Mask streams that I will hopefully be doing sometime in the near future. Like I said, this was the first time I played this game, but on top of that, I'm also playing these games in order of release, which means I've played the games that came out before this one, but not the ones after it, which will hopefully result in me having as little of a bias as I can possibly have by not being influenced by the later entries in the series. If at any point during this analysis you end up liking the video, feel free to like it, and maybe subscribe to the channel, and maybe even leave a comment if you want to help it out in the algorithm. Why do you like Ocarina of Time? Did you have the same experience with the game that so many others had? And do you think it deserves to be called the greatest video game of all time? Let me know down below. Without further ado, this is a review of The Legend of Zelda, Ocarina of Time. But first, before we get into the actual game, let's talk about
sell cars. Now I got a beautiful car here for you. All I want is $7,000. Look at this bitch. $7,000 for this car. But I got a slight dent in the back. You give me $7,000, all you gotta do is fix the back.
As is tradition, before we begin talking about the actual game, let's dive into the manual really quickly. So, is it any good? Well, I mean, it's a Zelda manual. Of course it's good. Shocker, I know. Seeing the Ocarina of Time art style here, it's very different from the previous entry's artwork, but honestly I really like it. I won't say that this artwork is necessarily better than the ones in A Link to the Past and Link's Awakening's manuals, mostly because I just really dig the 90s aesthetics of those, but I really like Yusuke Nakano's art style. It really gives Ocarina of Time a unique identity with these bold contours when compared to the previous entries. In fact, as some of you probably know, this guy has worked on a ton of art for the Zelda games. Seriously, for almost every single entry since Ocarina of Time, this guy has contributed to it in some way. Anyways, the manual itself is really neat, though it serves mostly as a utility device to help new players understand the game's mechanics, now more than ever before. Since we have actual cutscenes now, you really don't need to explain the story of the game in the manual. You can just play the game now and understand everything perfectly. The designers clearly understood this, which is why they went for the good old tried and true 2-page spread summarizing the setting of the game, rather than a detailed explanation of the plot. I won't go into it here, as this can wait for the story section of the video, but seriously, this entire plot summary can be seen in-game by completing the first dungeon. I really don't need to go into it here. As for the rest of the manual, it's got lots of life in it, the character designs are very appealing in my opinion, and the whole manual just looks great honestly. It's also got this world map featuring the characters you'll be seeing throughout the game. You might notice in the bottom right corner these 3 characters. Do they look familiar to you? These are Talon, Malon and Ingo, the 3 workers of Lon Lon Ranch, and references to Tarin, Marin and
鶏小屋のおじさん
from Link's Awakening. In fact, this game has quite a number of references to Link's Awakening, as you'll no doubt notice at various points throughout the video. As for the rest of the manual, it's just gameplay tips. Yeah, no bestiary or anything like that unfortunately, but honestly, I don't really mind that since, I mean, look at these pages, like, wow, these are awesome. Love the artwork so much. One last thing I want to mention is that now Link is once again named in the manual. In-game you can name him whatever you want to, which will probably result in some funny moments later in the game, but you know, it's nice to see it in the manual as well. And I think that's about everything I have to say about the manual, so we may now finally talk about the game itself, and no better place to start than at the beginning. Which leads us to...
Good to see you. Gordon, you lousy motherfucker. Get your dork ass down to the test chamber or else I will shove the sample up your ass. Stop fucking with the microwave.
Before we actually talk about what makes Ocarina of Time the greatest game of all time, we first need to discuss what makes a great game in general. And as I said before, what makes a game great is generally subjective, because people are different and like different things. For example, let's say you're into hack and slash games, but that doesn't mean that everyone likes that specific genre. Maybe you tried recommending Bayonetta to your friend, but they said that they didn't really like the game and that they enjoy visual novels a lot more. Maybe you yourself tried playing Devil May Cry 5, but found the gameplay to be too complicated for your liking, or maybe the story wasn't engaging enough in your opinion. Point is, there's lots of different aspects that make someone like a game, and lots of different aspects that make a game objectively good, and it ultimately boils down to how these different aspects interact with each other in order to form an experience. But at the end of the day, there is still some objectivity to these aspects, because something like Devil May Cry 5 is considered to be really good, while Devil May Cry 2, a game from the same franchise, is considered an awful tumor that attached itself to the DMC brand. So something clearly makes a game good or bad, as in it makes a game more or less enjoyable for most people. So the question is, what are these aspects? Well, here's how I see it. In my opinion, in order for a game to be considered great by most people, it needs to have a rewarding and satisfying gameplay loop that interacts with the story, which must have a coherent narrative that keeps the player interested, all the while having quality visuals and sound design that will allow the player to immerse themselves in the world of the game. Or in simpler terms, the gameplay must be fun, the story must be interesting, and the atmosphere must be appealing. Thus, these three elements are the pillars that make up an experience. When it comes to Ocarina of Time specifically, these three aspects are all executed exceptionally well, especially for the time the game came out. We'll start out with the gameplay, but before we get to that, we should talk about the opening act of the game. But before even that, I want to talk about the title screen first. One thing that is really important for a lot of media is first impressions. I mean, the reason why you got this far into the video is most likely because you really enjoyed that opening section. Those first 30 seconds are crucial to retaining viewership, as 50% of the people who clicked on the video leave once those 30 seconds are up. With video games, you'll notice how lots of popular games, and also games objectively considered to be good, often have really polished and well-made title screens. Three great examples that I can think of at the top of my head are Hollow Knight, Celeste, and A Hat in Time. Let's see here. Hollow Knight's title screen is very polished and slick looking, but on top of that, it evokes a sense of mystery and tragedy, with its melancholic tune playing in the background. It makes you feel a sense of sadness, or almost nostalgia, with feelings washing over you upon seeing it for the first time. I remember when I played this game for the first time back around early 2018, and I shed a tear the first time I booted up the game, and it still gets me very emotional every time I boot up the game today. Celeste is not as expertly crafted as Hollow Knight, but it's still got a very good title screen. Well, this game actually has two title screens. One of them is just the game's logo, but upon pressing the start button, you're booted to the main menu, which features the mountain Celeste itself as a 3D model rotating in the background, making for a very cool visual. Immediately when opening the game, you can tell that this is going to be a game about self-discovery and overcoming yourself, with this very subtle tune playing in the background along with the sound effects of a wind blowing. In contrast to these two, A Hat in Time takes a completely different approach. Its title screen is a very fun and lively one, with an upbeat tune playing and featuring wonderful animations that are so full of life, which goes to show what kind of a game this is supposed to be, and what kind of a story you can expect. It's a fun little tale about a girl traveling through space and collecting hourglasses, and running into trouble with the locals of the planets she visits, as well as helping them out, all the while trying to get back home. It's a goofy premise that allows the game to go all out with the wackiness, and it all makes for a very silly and fun time. Each of these sets a central theme that will run throughout the entire game's narrative, be it a tragedy, overcoming oneself, fun and exciting adventure with lots of goofy stuff happening along the way, or something else entirely. And then you've also got games with title screens that have the task of deceiving the player, but that's a whole different can of worms I won't be getting into. If we were to look at the Zelda series, every title screen so far has been very well executed. Zelda 1 and 2 are both simple, but both evoke a sense of being ready for an upcoming adventure. A Link to the Past has these sick rotating Triforce pieces, with the title of the game appearing and the Master Sword falling through it, which is then followed by the opening cutscene. And Link's Awakening has this pixelated opening depicting Link sailing, which then cuts to the game art style, then pans towards the Windfish's egg, with the title of the game appearing. All of these evoke feelings of being ready for an adventure, with them becoming more exciting and pleasing to look at with more powerful hardware. With all of that set up, let's look at the Ocarina of Time title screen. When booting up the game, you're greeted with the sound of a horse running, before the horse and its rider come into view. As the moon begins to set and the sun begins to rise in the background, the music kicks in. One of the most recognizable themes in video game history washes over you, as the camera changes its angle and the title of the game appears. The Legend of Zelda, Ocarina of Time. This title screen is extremely impressive for the time, showing Link riding his horse Epona across Hyrule Field, the biggest area in the game, which allows the player to immediately see the capabilities of the new system, and it also hypes them up for the journey, knowing that there's more of this along the way. Not to mention the way the scene is framed, how the sun rises, the lighting, it's just great. There's so many things that go into what makes this scene so incredible, but just like with Hollow Knight, The thing that makes it stand out so much is the music. This tune perfectly encapsulates what kind of a game this is going to be. It's a melancholic, almost sad tune, one that combines two instruments, a piano and an ocarina. I think the choice of picking these two instruments specifically is really interesting. I mean, picking the ocarina is an obvious choice since that's the name of the game, and the piano just sounds good, but let's try to look for some symbolism here because why not? The piano is often seen as a very elegant instrument, and is an instrument that can play a wide range of notes, and often people make whole careers off of just playing the piano. Not to mention that, throughout the majority of its history, only rich people were able to even get access to the instrument, and thus only the rich and the royalty would ever be able to actually play it. It's also a very highly regarded instrument that appears in a lot of media, and people are typically in awe when you tell them that you can play the piano. Meanwhile, the ocarina is a very niche instrument, originally made in Italy for folk music, with some sources stating that the instrument's origins date all the way back to the Balkans during the Neolithic period, although I don't really know if you can call this an ocarina. And it's an instrument that, besides the Zelda franchise and works referencing it, appears basically nowhere in media. In fact, I can't think of a single notable work of fiction where the ocarina is used, besides the Zelda franchise. What's that? It appears in Mother 1 as the Ocarina of Hope? Wow, I'm so glad I know about this information and I didn't Google it online. It can't play nearly as many notes as a piano, and when compared to regular flutes, it just looks like a toy. Not to mention that, for the majority of its history, it was used for playing folk songs by regular citizens, who would play them for family, friends, or on the road. It's a complete contrast to the elegance of a piano. And yet, when these two instruments come together, they can form such a remarkable tune that is so universally loved and recognizable. Not to mention that these two instruments, and them coming together, can actually be seen as Link and Zelda, with Link, a commoner, being the ocarina, and Zelda, the Princess of Hyrule, being the piano. Maybe this is all a bit of a reach, but if it was intentional, it's honestly such an incredible use of instruments. This one composition tells you everything about Ocarina of Time, even if you've never played the game. With zero exaggeration, it's one of the best title screens of all time, and it sets up an incredible first impression for the game. Starting with A Link to the Past, the file select screen also got background music, which is slightly different in each game. A Link to the Past really set a good standard for its successors, even with this small piece of music, which is always a nice tune to listen to that never gets repetitive, kind of like the main theme from Zelda 1. These are the Fairy Fountain themes, and these tracks are used for the file select themes in almost every game, save for the Game Boy games because the audio chip of the Game Boy is actually so trash it can't even produce the Fairy Fountain theme, so they actually have a different Fairy Fountain theme, as well as a different file select theme from the rest of the series. I'll play the A Link to the Past and Link's Awakening file select themes here though, because I didn't play them during those videos, and I think it would be good to listen to them and compare them to the Ocarina of Time rendition of this theme. So here are A Link to the Past and Link's Awakening file select. And here is the Ocarina of Time file select theme. Personally, and I know this isn't really a shocking revelation, but I like the Ocarina of Time rendition of this theme the most so far, but we'll see how this theme progresses later in the series. I'm pretty excited to see what they end up doing with it, because this is always one of my favorite compositions in these games. They're all seriously beautiful. And with that, it's time to get into the actual game.
Excuse me, sir. How much is this 50-cent honey bun?
$1.
$1?
Yeah.
You sure? God motherfucking damn.
Once you get past the file select screen, you're greeted with the opening cutscene, which depicts Link sleeping in his bed, which seems to be a reoccurring plot element at this point. We are then shown that he's having a nightmare, which depicts him standing in front of a castle when a woman and a young girl riding a horse run by, seemingly running away from some mysterious figure. Link then wakes up. As you might have guessed, the girl is Princess Zelda, and the green fella is our good old friend Ganondorf Jagmire, who was first introduced as such back in A Link to the Past's manual. As for this third character, this is actually the only other named character besides Link, Zelda and Ganon from Zelda 1. That's right, this is our old friend Impa. A different Impa from the one in Zelda 1 and 2, but a member of the Impa family nonetheless. She's Zelda's nanny in this game instead of a regular subordinate, and here she plays a much bigger role than she did in the first two games, though more about that in a later segment of the video. We're told that the place where Link is located is the Kokiri Forest, home to a species called the Kokiri, which are basically spirits of the forest. They're born with the bodies of young children, and they don't ever grow up. Therefore, their forms remain unchanging throughout their lives. Think angels from Lucifer, just imagine that they're children instead of very handsome men. Every Kokiri must remain within the confines of the forest, lest they perish forever. Every Kokiri also wears a green tunic and has a fairy that accompanies the Kokiri wherever they go. These fairies are gifts from the Great Deku Tree, the father of every Kokiri. The exception to the fairy rule is our protagonist, Link, who does not have a fairy until the start of the game. Right after the cutscene depicting Link's nightmare, we are shown the Great Deku Tree talking to a fairy, asking her to go tell Link that he must come before the Great Deku Tree and speak with him. The fairy flies out of the scene and into the Kokiri village, and this is a really cool moment. We're shown an aerial view of the entire area, seeing the residents of the village from the fairy's perspective. The fairy enters Link's house and wakes him up from his nightmare, telling him that the Great Deku Tree demands he speak to him. This is Navi the fairy, and she will from now on accompany Link anywhere he goes, finally making him a true Kokiri. More on Navi in just a moment, but for now you're finally allowed to play the game. Link talks to Saria and then makes his way to the Great Deku Tree, but Mido stops him in his tracks, saying how he has to have a sword and shield in order to pass. From here you are tasked with finding the Kokiri sword and buying the Kokiri shield. You can also interact with the locals here. The people here are kind of neutral to Link, or at least they're not openly aggressive to him. I think saying that they tolerate him is the best way of putting it. Most of them know him as that guy without a fairy, but they're not super mean to him or anything, except for Mido, who is openly just a dick to him. You've also got Saria, who appears to be Link's only friend. Once you obtain your sword and shield, Mido reluctantly allows you to pass, and after beating some enemies, you now may speak with the Great Deku Tree, who informs you that he has been cursed by Ganondorf, an evil man from the desert, and that you must break the curse, if you have enough courage and wisdom to do so, that is. This starts the first dungeon inside the Great Deku Tree. Upon clearing the first dungeon, you're treated to a cutscene depicting the creation of Hyrule. Before time existed, Din and Nairu and Farore, the goddesses of power, wisdom and courage respectively, gave creation to the land, spirit of law, and life forms to uphold the law, after which they departed for the heavens, leaving behind a familiar trinket at the place where they left the world, the Triforce, the golden triangle which had become the basis for the world's providence, with the land where it rests now being the Sacred Realm. All of this is basically just a slightly revised version of what we've seen in A Link to the Past manual, with the goddesses now having names and such. The Great Deku Tree insists that Ganondorf must never be allowed to enter the Sacred Realm and claim the Triforce for himself, as that would lead to a great calamity and the end of the world as we know it. He also says how, despite breaking the curse, he was doomed before Link arrived, so the whole stage was pointless, except for the fact that Link proved himself as courageous enough to take on the task of stopping Ganondorf from taking over the Sacred Realm and obtaining the Triforce. The final piece of information you receive from the Great Deku Tree is that you should go to Hyrule Castle, where you will meet the Princess of Destiny, and he also gives you the spiritual stone of the forest, the Kokiri Emerald, which you have to show to the princess, making sure she knows that you're the guy who's supposed to save Hyrule. After the death of the Great Deku Tree, you're finally allowed to leave the forest, with Saria waiting for you at the exit, where she says goodbye and gives you a parting gift, her ocarina. Yeah, this isn't the Ocarina of Time, it's some off-brand ocarina that she got 700 years ago from a suspicious guy at the local dollar shop. But hey, at least it's usable. I mean, it doesn't sound very good, but at least it's usable. After that, Link just runs away without even giving Saria a wave or a hug or a goodbye or anything. Man, no wonder no one likes this guy. But wait, how can Link leave the forest if he's a Kokiri? Well, that will be explained later, but like, we know he's Hylian and not actually a Kokiri, but for now pretend you have no idea. Once you and Navi, who will stick with you for the remainder of the game, exit the forest, you encounter this owl named Capora I can't pronounce his name. Keipora Gaebora, also known as Rauru. He's another reference to Link's Awakening, and just like in that game, he gives you directions on where your next objective is located. Once he flies away, the game opens up and you're allowed to explore the map. And now that all of that introductory tutorial stuff is out of the way, we can leave the rest of the story for later and talk about the gameplay in Ocarina of Time differs quite a bit from its predecessors, as now we have an extra dimension to work with. Let's see here. Link controlled pretty well in Zelda 1, A Link to the Past and Link's Awakening, hereafter being referred to as the top-down games, starting off with a grid-based movement system seen in Zelda 1, and then moving on to a more free-form movement by A Link to the Past. Both of these feel really good to control, even though the walk speed could have been tweaked to be slightly faster in my opinion, because especially in A Link to the Past, walking around the overworld actually takes quite a long time. Thankfully, both A Link to the Past and Link's Awakening have fast travel mechanics, as well as the Pegasus boots, which drastically helps with the pace of the game, especially in the case of A Link to the Past. And while Zelda 1 doesn't have either a fast travel mechanic or the Pegasus boots, it's also the game that suffers the least from being too slow out of these three, due to its grid-based movement system and smaller map. Although because Zelda 1 lacks an actual map, it's really easy to get lost in that game. You've also got Zelda 2, which, if I have to be honest, I don't think controls that well. The movement feels really sluggish and slow, as well as all of your animations just being really lengthy, which leads to the game feeling really slow to play. Both the startup and the end of your walk have a bit of a momentum to them, which further adds to this, and it's also just enough to make you fall into bottomless pits or get hit by enemies when you wouldn't have if it weren't for this mechanic. The attack action is also very lengthy, having this wind up for a few frames, which leaves you open for attacks from enemies, which can and will hit you often due to how much faster their attack animations are when compared to yours. A stark contrast to the top-down games where the attack goes off pretty much instantly. Combine this with no upgrades for either the movement or attack speed and you have a character that's not really fun to control. Getting the movement right is a really important task for any game developer, as having a character that feels like has to control will just frustrate players and most likely turn them away from the game that they were playing. Now, when you have a character that has already controlled well in 2D, you gotta make sure those controls translate well into 3D. Looking at the most obvious example, Mario felt really good to control in his early games, especially in Super Mario Bros. 3 and Super Mario World, where he had a lot of options for approaching the level design, be it via timing your jumps, bouncing off of enemies, using power-ups, etc. So, when designing Super Mario 64, the devs wanted to give the players freedom when it came to approaching the level design and puzzles, thus giving Mario lots of interesting movement options. And so, Mario 64 became a staple of what 3D platformers should strive to achieve. Now, when it comes to putting a character like Link into 3D, you gotta be more careful. You can't give Link the crazy acrobatic skills that Mario has, it just wouldn't feel right. So you have to create a moveset that's pretty limited, but also feels good to control. The controls need to be responsive and intuitive. So how does Ocarina of Time compare to its predecessors? Well, to start off, we have to talk about this, the N64 controller. More specifically, we have to talk about the analog stick of the controller. The analog stick was predominantly used for flight simulator games to better match the feeling of using a joystick, or control column, used in flight decks by pilots. But Nintendo decided to include it in the controller for their next home console, which would lead to the rest of the industry adopting the same principle, thus having an analog stick for your controller would become the new norm. The M shape of the controller can also potentially make it cumbersome to use, especially if you're like me and are used to the modern controllers, but you get used to it after a while. The point of the analog stick is that you can now move in any direction with ease, which is especially important in a 3D environment. The analog stick lends itself to more intuitive controls, ones that just weren't possible to achieve with only a D-pad, which translates into the game feeling really good to play. Well, that's the Ship of Arcanian version anyways, which is the undisputed best way to play the game. On original hardware, the game tends to lag during adult Link sections, and the game's resolution is set to 240p in a 4:3 aspect ratio, not to mention that the game's frame rate is capped to 20 frames per second. This can lead to Link feeling really sluggish to control, especially if you're used to playing games at smooth 60+ FPS. I mean, I tried playing Bloodborne at a friend's house a while back, and I genuinely had to turn off the game because its frame rate is capped at 30 frames per second. Bloodborne, regarded by many as one of the greatest video games of all time, was unplayable for me because it ran at 30 frames per second. I mean, I'm over-exaggerating a bit here. The frame rate is obviously something you'll get used to after a while, especially if the game is good, but when I tried setting Ocarina of Time from 60 FPS to 20 FPS, Well, you can probably imagine what my reaction was. It really is a big jump. Suffice to say, if you're playing the game on original hardware now, yeah, it will probably feel pretty jarring until you really get used to it. But on the other hand, unlike with Bloodborne, there is an actual way to play the game at 60 frames per second, meaning that there is a great modern way to experience this old game in a very fresh way that genuinely makes the game better. Does that change the original's feel? No, obviously. And I know there will definitely be people who will complain in the comments how this isn't the true way of playing the game and how playing the game at 20 FPS is the definitive way to play it. But like, come on man, would you really go back to playing Sonic 2 on the Genesis and going through these nightmarish, awful special stages when you know there is a 60 FPS HD port of the game that makes the special stages actually fun, on top of having the whole game run at widescreen? And would you really go back to playing the game at 20 frames per second when you know there is a highly moddable, open source, extremely customizable, amazingly performing, not sponsored version of Ocarina of Time out there? I think you get the point. And besides the increased frame rate, the actual game is exactly the same. So I think that playing the game like this is perfectly fine. Not to mention that I'm sure everyone would much prefer to watch this over this. But okay, let's get real here for a second. It is important to take into account how these controls felt back then, when you had nothing else to compare them to. In that context, yeah, Link sometimes feels sluggish and heavy. But overall, it's a pretty functional control system. Not to mention that even with the lack of interesting movement options like in Mario, the game still manages to not feel like its lack of a triple jump or whatever is a downside. So yeah, overall I think the game controls pretty well. If I had to compare the controls to any of the previous entries, I'd say it feels the closest to A Link to the Past. The controls are pretty tight and you feel like you are always in control of Link. Well, when you're using the regular boots at least. I also really like the animation for young Link when he's moving, cause he looks like he's about to trip and fall over all the time. Especially when you're wearing the Hylian shield, which, by the way, because it's too big for young Link, blocking with it makes him do this little animation, which I find pretty funny. The running speed is also set just right in my opinion. During regular gameplay and in dungeons, nothing is really too far away from the player at any given point. When entering Kakariko village, for example, there are two pathways that you can go down, technically three, but both are pretty close to you, as well as to each other, forming this sort of triangular shape, where it takes basically around 30 seconds to clear the entire area, and when walking from one side of the village to another, you can stop to enter houses or talk to NPCs along the way. Always having something close and within the reach of the player allows them to never feel like they're too slow, and it also makes the limited moveset not feel like a downside of the game. The dungeons are all built in a similar manner, so exploring them doesn't really feel tedious since you can get to new rooms often. Though it becomes a problem later on when you get kind of confused and have no idea where you're supposed to go, since the rooms kind of blend in with one another, but that's something I'll save for when we discuss dungeons. The only two areas that aren't like this would be Hyrule Field and Lake Hylia, where both of them suffer from being too large. Hyrule Field not as much, since once you get Epona, clearing this area isn't a problem anymore, and by then you'll also be able to use the ocarina to warp from dungeon to dungeon, but Lake Hylia is a giant lake, and later on a giant field, where you can't really use Epona to move around, so going through it is always kind of tedious, at least until you get a bean to grow near the laboratory. Speaking of Epona, you get her by doing this Yakuza sub-story where you have to race Waluigi on Lon Lon Ranch, and you have to beat him in a race with Epona twice, after which he will get really mad at you or something like that, and lock you inside of the ranch, not allowing you to escape, though you can just jump over this fence and unlock Epona forever, which allows you to ride her across Hyrule Field, like I said. Lon Lon Ranch is also where Malon and Talon live.
Okay, there's the owl. Fucking piece of shit. Okay, bro. What you got against me? Come on. Wait, hello? What you got against me? Why are you pushing me away? What the fuck is happening? What the... Okay.
And where you can listen to Malon sing Epona's song, which is really similar to Marin's Ballad of the Windfish from Link's Awakening. While we're on the topic of Link's Awakening, might as well mention the trading sequence quest, which returns from it. This quest functions in the exact same way as in Link's Awakening, You receive an item from a person and then give that item to another person, which then gives you a different item, and so on. On screen you can see the items you obtain and trade throughout the game, and here you have another reference to Link's Awakening via Kojiro, obviously being a reference to the legendary flying rooster in that game. The culmination of the trading sequence is obtaining the Bigoron sword from a giant Goron named Bigoron, which is a sword that's twice as strong as the Master Sword, but it requires you to two-hand it in order to use it. Not to be confused with the temporary giant's knife sold by Medigoron, Bigoron's younger brother.
Hit the wall. What? Does it like break or something? Immediately if I do that? What? Hit the wall with it. I'm hitting the wall. What? It breaks it after like 5 uses? What? Are you shit? What?
And while on the topic of trading sequences, there's a quest involving you giving out masks to different NPCs throughout Hyrule, although you only give out 4 of them before receiving the Mask of Truth, which allows you to read these gossip stones and provide some lore and gameplay tips for the player. You can find all 32 of them on websites such as Zelda Dungeon if you're interested in reading them all. As for the masks that you give out, you can wear them and they have some minor gameplay changes, but the last 3 you unlock after completing the quest give you no real benefit aside from looking funny. I think the mechanic could have been expanded on slightly more because it ends kind of early, and they clearly had more in mind with these other masks that just kind of go unused. And yeah, I know Majora's Mask is a thing, like, I'm not dumb. At least I like to think so. Back to gameplay mechanics, let's talk about combat. To put this simply, the game doesn't have a super deep combat system. Shocking, I know. There's a few different ways you can attack enemies in the game. You can use a stab attack or a jump attack, and that's about it. It's kind of a button mashing minigame at times, especially with these smaller enemies, but some enemies require you to stop and consider your approach. During combat, you can use Navi to lock onto a target, which is called Z-targeting. By doing this, you can lock the camera onto an enemy that you are currently fighting in order to have a clear view of them at all times, as well as perform some actions you otherwise can't, such as a jump attack by pressing the A button. This is actually something that Ocarina of Time invented, and it's a thing that a lot of modern games would use, such as Dark Souls. Recently I've been playing that game, trying to 100% it, and honestly it's been a really fun experience so far. Wait, what do you mean I 100%ed this game all the way back in December? And Dark Souls 2 as well? Sorry, I had to flex a bit with that last one. Another thing is that while you might think the A button is used for jumping, here the A button actually makes you do a roll. There is no manual jump button, and instead you climb by walking near a climbable wall, or jump when approaching a ledge. Think of it kind of like the Minecraft auto jump. Actually, this is way better, fuck the Minecraft auto jump. The auto jump is something that threw me off the first time I played the game, since literally every other game ever that you can jump in has a manual jump button. Except for like Dark Souls. Why does this video keep coming back to Dark Souls? Was Dark Souls inspired by Ocarina of Time? Well, actually yeah, it was. In fact, many developers, both new and veteran, often cite Ocarina of Time specifically as a major inspiration for their games. And not just smaller companies, but developers and directors of big titles such as Dark Souls, Final Fantasy, Uncharted, The Witcher, Shadow of the Colossus, and Grand Theft Auto all cite this game as a major inspiration, be it in regards to world building, world design, or just in general. This is one of the reasons why this game is regarded as such a legendary title. It single-handedly shaped what video games looked like from then on. It's basically the first video game. Like, yeah, it's not the first video game, but thanks to Ocarina of Time, we have the games that we have today, if that makes sense. And I mean, being a pioneer in a genre or being the first in something obviously has its downsides. Like, obviously now, some of its elements, or maybe even most of its elements, will feel dated, but back then, no game felt like Ocarina of Time. But back to the Dark Souls and Ocarina of Time comparison, they share quite a few similarities besides the obvious ones like the lock-on system, the lack of a jump button, the simplistic melee combat. Hidetaka Miyazaki, the director of Dark Souls, has stated in interviews that he was very much inspired by Zelda when creating the game, as well as his other works, although he feels as if his games are nowhere near the ranks of the Zelda games, which I find both funny and relatable. But let's see where this inspiration can be seen. Both games have a great sense of scale and an open world that you can lose yourself in. Exploring both Hyrule and Lordran is a satisfying feeling, always trying to see how much farther you have to go to get to the next objective or checkpoint, or perhaps a new dungeon or boss, where these dungeons and bosses aren't just concepts shoved into the game for the sake of having content. They actually play a role in the story and the world they inhabit and are built with purposeful intent. Every level exists for a reason, and every boss is woven into the narrative in some way. Even for the shitty ones, their presence makes sense in the world that they inhabit. Well, most of the time anyway. Getting to talk to a new NPC and seeing their dialogue is also a great reward for playing the game, in both cases. So yeah, Dark Souls is peak, you should play it sometime. Where the games differ, however, is in their hand-holdiness, so to call it. Where Dark Souls lets the player get lost in its world and explore Lordran on their own, in Ocarina of Time you won't really ever get lost, not only because Navi keeps telling you where to go every 10 minutes, but also because the map is pretty small when compared to modern titles, and it feels especially so if you played it many times already. Of course, this is excusable. Hardware limitations obviously had an impact on the game's design. This bad boy is 32 megabytes in size. Back then this was gigantic, but nowadays, I mean, a 10-minute video on your phone is probably larger than that. For 32 megabytes, this is insanely impressive technically. In fact, there's this unfinished game project I made when I was like 13 or 14, and just look at this shit. Okay, just from this preview, can you tell me how big this game is? How big do you think this game is? This tiny little project that I made for a game jam when I was like 14. Go on, take a guess. 1 gigabyte. So yeah, from a technical standpoint, this game is a marvel, just like its predecessor. I mean, A Link to the Past had a ton of content, and that game was literally 1 megabyte in size. If you take 2 selfies on your phone, that's literally larger than this entire game, and 60 images would be larger than Ocarina of Time. Crazy to think how far we've come. Anyways, I'm kind of beating a dead horse here, chances are you already know all of this. Speaking of things you probably already know, here's an easy one. A thing that many players cite as a form of frustration would, of course, be Navi. Probably the most infamous Zelda companion in the entire series. Well, I guess that depends on whom you ask. You know, a really funny thing that I learned while making this video is that Shigeru Miyamoto himself has expressed frustration with the fairy navigation system in past interviews, and has stated that he actually wanted to remove the system in its entirety. When asked in an interview about the difficulty of the game, particularly the puzzle-solving aspect of it, Miyamoto said, quote, "I think the way we give hints is still a little too unfriendly. Speaking plainly, I can now confess to you, I think the whole system with Navi giving you advice is the biggest weak point of Ocarina of Time. It's incredibly difficult to design a system that gives proper advice that's tailored to the player's situation. To do it right, you'd have to spend the same amount of time as you would developing an entire game, and I was very worried we'd be digging ourselves into a hole if we pursued perfection there. If you read Navi's texts, she says the same things over and over. I know it makes it sound bad, but we purposefully left her at a kind of stupid level. I think if we tried to make Navi's hints more sophisticated, that stupidity would have actually stood out even more. The truth is I wanted to remove the entire system, but that would have been even more unfriendly to players. You can think of Navi as being there for players who stop playing for a month or so, who then pick the game back up and want to remember what they were supposed to do. It's a brazen excuse, I know. Otherwise, we tried to make the hints friendly to players, but I heard many people saying how they couldn't solve them without a strategy guide. When we took a closer look, we found that the sections people need hints for vary from person to person. There is no consistency. That can't be helped though, in a game like Zelda which combines action and puzzle solving. I'll leave the link to the interview in the description in case you want to read it for yourself, because this video is already getting really long and I don't want it to be even longer by going over an entire interview. So yeah, if you feel like Navi is stupid and annoying, just know the literal creator of the game feels the same way. But let's dive into the matter and see what makes Navi so infamously frustrating. I've already talked about how you can use Navi to lock onto enemies in order to have an easier time fighting them, but while locked on, you can also press up on the C-pad in order to get information on enemies' weak points during combat, and this aspect of the mechanic is totally fine and actually really good. But what about when you're just exploring the map? Well, when you're not locked onto an enemy with the Z button, by pressing up on the C-pad, you can enter first-person mode and rotate the camera using the analog stick to better position yourself, which is an interesting way of rotating the camera, and a nice workaround for lacking a second analog stick, with which you would be able to rotate the camera on later hardware. You can also use Navi to talk to NPCs while you're locked onto one in case they're far away or something, but more importantly, at random points during your playthrough, Navi will yell, "Hey!" and by pressing up on the C-pad, you can talk to her, where she will give you a tip on where you're supposed to go next. And there's no point in beating around the bush. The biggest problem and the biggest criticism in regards to Navi is the fact that the hints that she gives you are basically useless, as she will give you information on things that you either already know or don't care about. It feels condescending to players because while the game was rated D for everyone, like, come on guys, are we making sure the 5-year-olds aren't confused? That in itself wouldn't be so bad if it weren't for the fact that Navi will show up as a prompt on screen with the same hey sound effect very often. I'm not sure how often she actually yells at you to listen to her, but it feels like it takes around 5 to 10 minutes for her to yell at you again after you answer her call. The point of these tips is to reduce the frustration of exploring the world looking for the next objective, but the thing is, your objective is literally stated to you every time you clear a dungeon, and yet Navi just repeats it constantly. The hints that she gives are also very vague and very rarely actually help you. And when they do actually help you, it's mostly just information you already know. Like, I'm not saying the game should hold your hand, don't get me wrong, but if you're gonna have a hint system that just tells you what you already know, or puts it in vague terms that you don't understand, then that's just not a well-designed hint system. And even the creator thinks so, and yet it's still in the game. How is this real? At that point, just have a tab in the menu that tells you where to go, which there is, by the way. On the map, the place where you're supposed to go is highlighted, but then there's no point in having Navi give you hints at all, because she just brings nothing by doing so half the time. In the early game, she's more useful because it isn't quite as obvious where you're supposed to go, but later on you can really just figure everything out on your own, especially by the last 2 dungeons. She also doesn't give you any hints during the dungeons, which are arguably the most confusing part of the game. Hyrule, I'd say, is pretty well designed with recognizable and easily distinguishable points, but the dungeon rooms tend to feel very samey, especially during the middle point of the game. You know which ones I'm referring to if you've played the game. And it's especially frustrating because you get done going through a confusing level with no help whatsoever.
What is the heart container? Oh, there it is. Oh my god. Okay, get me the fuck out of here, bro. I'm never going back here again. I'm not doing a second playthrough. Oh my god. But okay. We beat... I won't call it hell, but a very unpleasant place.
And then get told where to go once you're done with the dungeon. Then 5 minutes later, while you're doing a side quest, Navi goes all like, you haven't arrived at the destination yet, go here please, my family is starving and I don't get paid enough to do this. Like, I feel like Navi could have been an interactable part of the menu, where you could click on her and she would tell you where to go when you're lost. Or hell, just have the objective placed at the top of the menu in case you forget it. But you can also use the ocarina to play Saria's song and ask Saria for help in case you ever get stuck. So even if Navi was an interactable part of the menu, she'd still be useless. And just to put some more fuel to the fire, remember the owl guy? Yeah, he gives you tips as well. No matter how you spin it, from whatever angle you try to look at it, Navi is just bad, she sucks. And the worst part of it all is, I actually like her. Like, yeah, she is annoying, but like, Navi is cute. She actually has voice clips that play at certain moments, and I personally find them adorable. I really like her voice.
Hello? Look! Hey! Listen! Watch out!
Navi also doesn't really have much of a personality throughout the game, because she barely speaks at all. But I personally think that Navi still should be in the game despite her hint system being kind of terrible. This is something we'll be seeing in later games as well, the whole Link partnering up with a character for one game and then that character is never seen again thing. But that's a trope I honestly don't mind and actually kind of like. And I think this rendition of that companion trope is actually pretty good, especially for a first time implementation. The hints are a bit annoying, but that's about it. And even despite her rather lackluster implementation, I still really like Navi and I think she really should be in the game, because it gives the game ever so slightly more personality thanks to her. And yeah, that's kind of the only genuine complaint I have about the gameplay, as being confused and running through dungeons for an hour boils down to if the player is stupid or not, which I happen to be. Well, except for maybe one dungeon. I think the gameplay holds up really well, even today. Above all else, playing Ocarina of Time is fun, and I think that's really the most important part of any game. Of course, the story is really important, and so is the general atmosphere and the various other features of the game. Like, they all go into what makes the game so fun and enjoyable. But, I mean, what's the game without the gameplay, right? I mean, at that point, you could just make a show or a movie. Or a fucking visual novel or something, I don't know. Now, I'd like to talk about the atmosphere at this point, mostly because I want to save the story for the last segment of the video, but in order to do that, we need to talk about
Coca-Cola! Coca-Cola! Don't forget the ice! And I'm not making money off the monkey foot, bitch! So I'ma sell clocks, bitch! Motherfucking clocks! Look at this ancient-ass clock here. This motherfucking clock here is nice. You need to goddamn tell the time and everything. God motherfucking... Damn! What happened to my motherfucking cloud, bitch? I'm a bro. Why? Help! God motherfucking damn.
The Master Sword once again serves as the main MacGuffin of the story. It wasn't present in Link's Awakening because the story didn't take place in Hyrule, but now that we're back in Hyrule and on a home console, it's back as well. This time around, the Master Sword no longer has the ability to shoot out projectiles when at full health, which is reasonable since it would probably be a nightmare to aim the projectiles in a 3D environment. This time around, the Master Sword is located in the Temple of Time, unlike in A Link to the Past where it is located in the Lost Woods. To be honest, I'm not exactly sure as to why the Temple of Time wasn't present in A Link to the Past. I mean, obviously the idea of the Temple of Time wasn't a thing when they made A Link to the Past. Miyamoto himself stated in that interview I mentioned earlier that they focused on making their games good first and foremost, and that the way they all tie into each other was always kind of secondary, but let's be real here. There needs to be some kind of an explanation as to why this is the case in the context of the Zelda universe. I don't know if there is an official explanation for this, but if there is, or if you have any theories on why only the Pedestal of Time remains in A Link to the Past, feel free to let me know down in the comments. Anyways, the Master Sword is obviously one of the most important aspects of this game, so let's see what the story looks like up until Link obtains it for the first time. Once you clear out the first dungeon, you have to go to Hyrule Castle grounds, where after getting past the guards and the Sleeping Talon for some reason, you finally get to meet the Princess of Destiny. Link shows Zelda the Kokiri Emerald, after which she recognizes him as the Hero of Time, and then she introduces both Link and Navi as well as the player to the main antagonist of the game, as they all peer through a window to see an evil-looking man talking to the King of Hyrule. Zelda elaborates that this is Ganondorf, and that despite swearing his loyalty to the royal family, he is not to be trusted. Ganondorf then looks through the window to catch a glimpse of Zelda and Link staring through it, although they hide before he can make sure he wasn't just imagining things. Or at least that's what they think. Link meets Impa and then sets out to find the other two spiritual stones, Goron's Ruby, which he obtains from Daruni after clearing out the Dongo Cavern, and Zora's Sapphire, which he obtains from Ruto after rescuing her from inside Jabu Jabu's belly. I know that sounds kind of weird to say out loud, but I promise you this is crucial for the plot later on. Before Link heads out to search for these, Impa teaches him his first song, Zelda's Lullaby, which you repeatedly use throughout the game to prove your connection to the royal family of Hyrule, open different pathways in dungeons, as well as solve puzzles. Other songs include Epona's Song, Saria's Song, Song of Storms, Sun's Song, and Song of Time, all of which will allow you to interact with the world or certain objects in various ways. The ocarina is a really cool item. Wind instruments have been an element in every game thus far, even in Zelda 2 despite its structure, and an ocarina specifically has appeared in the last two games, although the ability to play different songs has appeared only in Link's Awakening prior to Ocarina of Time, with it exclusively being used as a fast travel tool in A Link to the Past. Honestly, I really like the ocarina as both a gameplay and a story concept. It's one of those things that really make the Zelda series stand out ever so slightly more from other games, bringing to their uniqueness. On top of that, the ocarina in Ocarina of Time isn't just a gameplay prop, but an actual instrument. The developers programmed an actual ocarina, complete with all the notes you can play on a real-life ocarina. You can play actual songs on this thing, which is crazy. In fact, in this official Nintendo Player's Guide, which you can see on screen now, you can see the developers encouraging the player to experiment with the ocarina and even try to play the Kakariko village theme. And yes, this also works on the 3DS, although the button layout is a little bit different. On top of the custom songs and the aforementioned songs you learn while playing the game, you also have the 6 songs taught to you by Sheik, which are used to warp to dungeons. Minuet of Forest, Bolero of Fire, Serenade of Water, Requiem of Spirit, Nocturne of Shadows, and Prelude of Light, the first 5 of which teleport you to their respective dungeon, and the last one allowing you to warp to the Temple of Time. Speaking of the Temple of Time, once we obtain all of the spiritual stones, we can finally actually do something here. And this is where the game goes from pretty good to incredible based on presentation alone. So the reason why you spent the last few hours looking for the spiritual stones, other than because Zelda told you to do so, is because you need them in order to open the Door of Time to access the hidden treasure of this temple, that being the Blade of Evil's Bane, also known as the Master Sword. And with the Master Sword, Link would be able to protect the Sacred Realm and the Triforce alongside it from Ganondorf. After obtaining all 3 spiritual stones and playing the Song of Time on the Ocarina of Time, the Door of Time will open and allow Link to get the Master Sword and enter the Sacred Realm. However, he needs to be careful when doing this. According to Zelda, Ganondorf wishes to access the Sacred Realm in order to get his hands on the Triforce, which she has apparently foreseen in her dream, along with Link's arrival. Her father doesn't believe that Ganondorf would betray the kingdom, so Zelda asks Link for help in getting to the Sacred Realm before Ganondorf, which she would do by opening the Door of Time and obtaining the Master Sword in order to protect the Triforce. She also says that, in order to open the Door of Time, you need to possess the Ocarina of Time, which she is currently hiding from Ganondorf.
Before entering the Temple of Time, you have to get to Hyrule Castle, which prompts the sequence we saw in Link's dream at the beginning of the game to play. Only this time, Zelda throws some kind of an object in the moat while her and Impa ride a horse out of castle grounds, which is when Link turns around and comes face to face with Ganondorf for the first time. This is one of my favorite scenes in the entire game, and it perfectly captures how menacing and terrifying Ganondorf is, as he towers over Link with this menacing grin on his face. Ganondorf politely asks Link where Zelda ran off to, which Link responds to by pulling out his Kokiri sword, looking to fight Ganondorf right then and there, and Ganondorf commends him for having the guts to do so, after which he does a Biden blast and makes Link fall on his ass, and then he runs away. After this cutscene, Link goes to the moat to pick up the Ocarina of Time, and then gets a vision on how to play the Song of Time from Zelda. Link then heads to the Temple of Time and opens the Door of Time, and there lies the Master Sword waiting for him. This scene is also amazing and I really love it. It's very reminiscent of the Link to the Past scene where Link obtains the Master Sword for the first time as well. However, what happens after you obtain the Master Sword is that the entrance to the Sacred Realm gets opened and Link steps inside it. But in a 300 IQ move, instead of following Princess Zelda and Impa to wherever they were headed, Ganondorf actually followed Link inside the Temple of Time, waited for him to open the entrance to the Sacred Realm, which is when he snuck into the Sacred Realm and obtained the Triforce. Once this cutscene plays out, Link finds himself in the Sacred Realm in front of a sage known as Rauru, which is actually the owl guy from earlier. Rauru explains that Ganondorf managed to obtain the Triforce on that fabled day 7 years ago. Yes, 7 years ago. See, Link was around 9 years old when he obtained the Master Sword, which, while the sword deemed him courageous enough to wield it, he wasn't old enough for it, which is why the sword placed him inside of the Sacred Realm until he aged up to an adult, which in the game is 7 years later at the age of 16. In those 7 years, a few things had happened. For starters, Link looks different. He got some sick earrings while in the Sacred Realm, but more importantly, he's older now, ready to fight for the future of Hyrule. He is now truly the hero of time. And as for Ganondorf, he didn't manage to obtain the full power of the Triforce, the reason for which is explained near the end of the game, but for context I'll explain it now. If you remember from A Link to the Past, when someone obtains the Triforce, their heart must possess an equal amount of power, wisdom and courage. If the heart of the user does not possess an equal amount of those traits, the Triforce gets split into 3 corresponding pieces, and those 3 pieces go to the 3 people in the world who have the most power, wisdom or courage in their hearts. Ganondorf obviously has the most power out of anyone in the world, so the Triforce of Power goes to him. And with just that piece alone, he was able to completely transform and terrorize the world over the last 7 years. You know, it's actually quite funny how this entire thing happened. Because Zelda and Link wanted to access the Sacred Realm to guard it from Ganondorf, the plan ended up backfiring so badly that now the entire world has been brought to ruin, directly by the 2 of them. And I guess by the Great Deku Tree, Daruni, Naruto and Impa, but that's besides the point. The 2 of them, mere kids, thought they could beat an unstoppable force, but they ended up playing right into its hands. And if you know anything about Ganondorf as a character in general, you know that he's not a force to be reckoned with. And even if you don't, just based on his appearance in A Link to the Past and even Zelda 1, and hell, even the spin-off entries like the comics and the manga, he's clearly shown to be a serious threat. However, in spite of everything, according to Rauru, there is still hope. By locating the 7 sages, one of them being Rauru himself, Link can help seal Ganondorf inside the Sacred Realm for good. Link sets out into the remains of Hyrule after the 7 years of Ganondorf's rule in order to find the remaining sages, and thus you're allowed to explore the adult timeline. Before exiting the Temple of Time, he meets Sheik, a mysterious Sheikah, who seems to be someone who really wants to help Link. You meet Sheik a number of times throughout the game, often when entering a new dungeon, which is when she will teach you a song by playing it on her lyre, or goddess's harp, as it would come to be known later in the series. All of these songs will allow you to fast travel to their respective dungeon, as mentioned before. And now with all of that out of the way, Link has now obtained the Master Sword and is set out in the search for sages, which means we can finally talk about
Scream if you love Ocarina of Time.
Ocarina of Time, much like A Link to the Past, is split into two parts, the child timeline and the adult timeline, both of which you can access by traveling through time via placing the Master Sword back at the Temple of Time or raising it out from the Pedestal of Time. By playing the Prelude of Light taught to you by Sheik, you can teleport to the Temple of Time and travel through time whenever you wish to. The two timelines are vastly different from one another. They each have a unique look and feel, with the child timeline having this whimsical and magical aesthetic to it, with everything feeling quite right, and the adult timeline being this deserted, apocalyptic wasteland, with everything feeling wrong, for the lack of a better term. It's a really nice contrast between the two timelines, further helping differentiate them. The two timelines are closely connected, and actions in the past will affect the world in the future. This gameplay mechanic was similarly explored in A Link to the Past, but only really in this one instance where you pull a lever to drain the water in the light world, which drains it in the dark world. In Ocarina of Time, however, story progression is locked behind performing certain actions in the past. Whenever you clear a dungeon, you free a sage, but all of the dungeons that contain a sage are located in the future. Sometimes, in order to access these dungeons, you have to do certain things in the past or the future. Like, for example, you can't get past Mido in the future and access the Forest Temple until you play him Saria's song, which you can only learn by talking to Saria at the entrance to the Forest Temple in the past. Or for another example, you can't progress through the Spirit Temple until you complete Nabru's side quest in the past, but in order to even get to the Spirit Temple in the past, you have to get through the Gerudo Fortress in the future. Then, while still in the future, get to the Spirit Temple, where Sheik will teach you the Requiem of Spirit, which you then have to play in the past to get to the Spirit Temple and do Nabru's little side mission. It's not just when it comes to accessing temples either. In the past, you can plant beans on certain soil spots throughout Hyrule, and they grow into plants which carry you around areas in the future. You can also talk to Medigoron in the past, where he says he's cooking something up and that it'll take him around 5 or 6 years to finish, and when you talk to him in the future, he'll offer to sell you a giant's knife, which yeah, is super hilariously bad in game, but in story context it's a really cool inclusion. Overall, I really like this gameplay concept, especially since it's executed so well. You know, many media have trouble with time travel stories because time travel is very easy to completely fuck up, where your narrative just becomes full of plot holes or straight up makes no sense. But that's not the case in Ocarina of Time. When you go back in time, you go back to the exact point when you picked up the Master Sword, and when you place it back down, you go exactly 7 years into the future every single time. No dilemmas, no misunderstandings, it all just makes sense. When it comes to the atmosphere in general, I won't go super in depth about absolutely everything that you can find in Hyrule of Past and Future, as this video would probably be like 4 hours long at the very least if I did that. But I will say that both versions of Hyrule are really great locations. They were massive and full of life for their time, and to this day they're really fun locations to explore and get lost in. There is nothing that feels super out of place, and the characters and locations that they find themselves in all make sense, and the world they inhabit feels very much alive. I mean, sure, there is some goofy stuff, like this PNG of a shark in this one hidden corner of the map that's here for like no reason whatsoever. And then there's also the talking cows found in random underground burrows throughout the map, which like, okay, but honestly I don't mind all that stuff. It's pretty funny all things considered, and more importantly, it isn't egregious enough to the point where it breaks the immersion. Hyrule feels like a real location, a real place that exists and that people live in, and that's what's most important about any world that you end up making. So anyways, there's a few different categories that we can splice this section into, so let's do exactly that, starting with...
Yeah, hold on a second, I'm looking at the menu. Please, don't offer me anything. I'll tell you what I want. Okay. You know how you have the 6-piece nuggets? Just, can you give me just 4 nuggets? I'm trying to... Shut up and listen to my order. Take the 6 nuggets and throw 2 of them away. I'm just wanting the 4 nugget thing, I'm trying to watch my calorie intake. Put 2 of them up your ass and give me 4 chicken McNuggets.
I think the graphics are a good place to start. While people will argue how the graphics aren't what makes a game good or bad on their own, it's still important to take into consideration that what your game looks like is still really important, as the visuals need to be appealing and fit the atmosphere of the game. The time when Ocarina of Time was made was a transitional period where people started experimenting with 3D models and creating 3D environments and characters. If there is a period in time where graphics are gonna be jarring, then it's gonna be this one. They're not hyper-realistic like the graphics of games that we have today, and they're also not timeless in a way 2D graphics are. The graphics of this game are something that's no doubt aged. I mean, this game came out 25 years ago, that's kind of a given really. The backgrounds during some shots are pre-rendered instead of them being 3D models, and the same goes for some environments. Like for example, these stairs are just a texture slapped on top of a model instead of each stair being individually modeled. Not to mention that while at the time Hyrule Field was visually very impressive and a technical marvel, Nowadays it just feels pretty empty, let's be real here. While all of that is not necessarily a bad thing, it is still a fair criticism to throw, as despite the fact that the game is so old, it doesn't change the fact that it still looks the way it does. But I also think it's important to note how good this game looked back in the day. Now, just for a moment, close your eyes and imagine yourself back in 1998, right before playing your first 3D game. All you've ever known up until this point is this: pixels. And then you see this. Honestly, if I was in that position, I'd probably piss myself in excitement as well. It really is difficult to imagine seeing how far we've come today, but back then, this was it. This was high-end. And I'm probably not the first person to say this, but personally, being fully honest, I really like how Ocarina of Time looks. Despite its obviously dated appearance, I think that this game has some serious charm. The way Link moves and interacts with the environment, the little jumping animation he does when you're Z-targeting an enemy, the rolls, the backflips, all of the details that went into making each interaction feel fun and exciting, in turn make the game feel really fun and exciting to look at. The game certainly isn't ugly, and therefore the aforementioned negatives don't really bother me. And you especially wouldn't be able to notice this on a CRT TV back in the day anyway. Honestly, I think some of these low-res textures really work wonders, especially in some dungeons like the Forest Temple and the Shadow Temple, which are meant to be really moody, and where I feel like these low-res textures actually really add to the stage's atmosphere, rather than take away from it. All of this might seem like a glazing, to be honest, and I mean, yeah, maybe it is. I mean, objectively speaking, it's not as impressive anymore, but these graphics are made in such a way that it's not something that takes away from the experience, which I think is ultimately important. It doesn't look awful by any stretch of the imagination, and for a lot of people, including myself, it looks very appealing. And personally, and I know this is kind of controversial, but I think these older graphics actually fit the game more than the more cartoony aesthetic of Ocarina of Time 3D. I know that's a bold statement to make, but I think this more realistic aesthetic, although technically less polished and worse quote-unquote than the more Disney-like aesthetic of the remake, are a lot more appropriate for a game like Ocarina of Time. And I know that's not how everyone is going to feel, at the end of the day it's just personal preference, but then again, it is my video, so I think giving my opinion on things is the point here. When it comes to cutscene animation, this one is also aged, but I don't think it's on the level of, say, Sonic Adventure 1. I think the cutscenes really bring a lot to the game, especially with how many of them there are, and they're surprisingly very watchable. I didn't really find myself cringing at the animation whatsoever, and I really enjoyed the game's many cutscenes. When it comes to the models though, I do think some of them look kind of bad. Well, okay, maybe bad is a bit of a strong term. Like Ganondorf, for example, doesn't really look bad, he just looks kind of weird in some angles. But then you have stuff like Adult Zelda, which like... what the hell is that hairline, dude? That shit is receding as hell. No wonder she wears a headdress in the past. And then you've got the giant fairies that can be found throughout Hyrule, which are some of the most horrifying abominations I've seen in my life. Like, holy shit, dude. It doesn't help that the sound that they make when they appear and disappear is also one of the most horrific sounds I've ever heard. But in general, I do like how the models look. They're honestly really good for the time. And I also like how expressive the character animations are. The eyes, eyebrows, and mouths of all of these models are actually just textures slapped on top of them, which allows the developers to save on resources and animate the two-dimensional graphics slapped on top of them with ease. This is something I especially noticed during the last Ocarina of Time stream, when I was going through the beginning of the game once again to collect some footage that I lost back during the first stream, and I got to this part where Zelda asks you if you believe her about Ganondorf being evil. If you say no here, she has probably the saddest look in her eyes I have ever seen. It's all very subtle, but honestly, these simple graphics do a great job at portraying how she's feeling. Confused, sad, scared that you're not believing her, but also kind of understanding as to why you're not believing her, because pretty much everyone has told her that her vision is pure nonsense. All around, it's great stuff. Originally I was gonna criticize young Zelda's model for looking kind of as well, but honestly after seeing this, I take it all back, this stuff is great. Proper use of 2D images can really elevate an experience and make both the characters and the world feel grander and more natural, and this isn't the last time we'll be seeing something like that as well in this series. And honestly, that makes me pretty excited for future videos, especially for the Wind Waker, since these facial animations can get really expressive. I actually wanted to talk about the models of the game, specifically the Young Link and Adult Link models, since these models are actually very well designed and they're a lot more complex than you probably think they are. So as you probably already know, any 3D model is made up of polygons, and from my understanding, although I'm not an expert on this matter, There exist three main types of polygons, namely tris or triangles, which are polygons that have 3 vertices and 3 edges, quads or quadrilaterals, which are polygons that have 4 vertices and 4 edges, and n-gons, which can be divided into tris and quads if need be. From my understanding, using quads for making models is preferred nowadays since they're a lot more flexible than tris, but people still use tris for certain things, like for example, all Link models throughout the series are actually composed entirely of tris, even the Breath of the Wild Link. The model for young Link in this game consists of 726 tris, and for adult Link it's actually slightly less at 679 tris. Now you might be thinking, is this a lot of tris or what? Well, for reference, Breath of the Wild's Link model consists of 12,541 tris, almost 10 times as many as the two Links in Ocarina of Time combined. And Breath of the Wild's Link model is actually on the lower end of how many polygons are used for character models nowadays, which often have anywhere from 10,000 to 25,000 polygons. As for an environmental object like Hyrule Castle, for example, I don't actually have a source for this one, but I've seen on some old forums that its polygon count is around 1500 polygons, which is tiny when compared to environments of today, which can go up to hundreds of thousands in polygon count. But that's not all. During this era of video games, it was a common practice to make separate models for certain objects such as the player and some environments. These separate lower poly models would be swapped out instead of the regular models at certain points, namely when the camera is far away enough from an object in order to save up on memory. Playing the game on a CRT TV on the N64, this is really difficult to notice due to the low resolution, as well as the display quality, but you can see this really easily if you're playing the game on an emulator. It's most noticeable in the Temple of Time when approaching the Master Sword, where you can see how the game loads in geometry when you approach it. You can even see this method being used in some more modern games for the environments, but when it comes to character models, this isn't really something that developers use nowadays because, well, it's a lot more noticeable on an HD LCD display. If you're interested in polys and video game character models, I strongly suggest you check out A+ Start's video series Low Poly on YouTube. That's where I learned all of this stuff, and honestly, I think you'll have a great time with those videos. Overall, I'd say this game is artistically very pleasing, despite its age. It surprisingly holds up pretty well. Okay, let's talk about the music now.
When Big Larry came out just to put him down, SpongeBob turned into a clown, and no girl ever wants to dance with a fool who went and ripped his pants. I know I shouldn't mope around, I shouldn't curse, but the pain feels so much worse.
When it comes to the music, I think the soundtrack is very good. I'd say it's the most enjoyable one so far, which makes sense, as the N64 was the most powerful Nintendo console at the time of its release. When it came to previous games, they would usually vary in quality, but I don't think that's the case in Ocarina of Time. Pretty much every track is a slam dunk, and that actually says a lot considering there's like 80 tracks in this game. Koji Kondo, the mastermind behind the OSTs of Zelda 1 and A Link to the Past, returned for this game, and I personally think he really blew it out of the park this time, especially with the title theme, which we've already discussed. It's just a really good soundtrack with many memorable songs, although, interestingly enough, this game doesn't actually feature the classic Zelda theme that has appeared in every game thus far in some form. The soundtrack just really slaps. I'll play some of the songs that I thought were highlights of the game, and in case this section gets muted, just know I got hit with a copyright strike or something. That being said, take a listen.
As I mentioned before, I also really like Epona's song, the little lullaby that Malon sings on Lon Lon Ranch. But if I had to pick my favorite track, it would definitely be the one most people think is the best one in the whole game, and that is, of course, the Gerudo Valley theme. On top of the Gerudo Valley having my favorite track, it also has my favorite dungeon in the game, the Gerudo Fortress. I love basically everything about it. The sneaking around, the mini-bosses, the little side quest where you have to free these guys from the feminism prison, and then they rebuild a bridge that you had to cross with Epona. And I also love how if you get caught by the guards, instead of being teleported to the start of the area like in Hyrule Castle grounds, Link gets thrown in fucking jail. Like, that's mad funny. Even if it gets a bit annoying having to escape from your cell every time you get caught. So far you can hopefully see why I like the atmosphere of this game so much, but as I mentioned before, the N64 version of the game, which is also the version that Ship of Arcanian runs, is not the only version of the game, so that begs the question.
Damn, I messed up. We gotta go ball.
Okay, let's talk about Ocarina of Time 3D, the 3DS remake of Ocarina of Time, since some people asked me to play this version instead of the N64 one, which I ultimately decided against because I thought that experiencing the original first would give me a better overall understanding of why people love this game so much. Now, just to clarify, I haven't played Ocarina of Time 3D yet, but I do know a little bit about it, so I'll just very briefly go over some stuff that's different here and what makes this version unique. If you're really against using Ship of Arcanian, this is probably the best way to experience this game nowadays, even though a 3DS as well as a copy of this game are rather hard to come by nowadays. Ocarina of Time 3D has a more Disney-like aesthetic, as opposed to the original, which has a darker, more realistic approach to its visuals, but I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing, especially because the visuals look good when taking into account that this is a 3DS screen we're talking about. But when it comes to me specifically, I do overall prefer the original's look. I think some of the music is different between the original and 3D, though unless you're a die-hard fan of the original soundtrack, I don't think it's too jarring to listen to the new songs, though I totally get if you're turned off by such a thing. I personally really dislike when developers do that, but I can kind of understand why they would do such a thing. The gameplay mechanics are also more fine-tuned, and lots of little annoying things like the iron boots not being a toggleable item are fixed and streamlined in 3D, and you also have things such as gyro controls when aiming. Overall, I think that both versions are great, it just depends on what version you enjoy more between the two. Anyways, that's enough about Ocarina of Time 3D for now, because as I said, I haven't played this version yet, so I can't really give a proper review of it. We'll talk about it more in depth one day, but for now, let's continue talking about Ocarina of Time for the N64. Goron reproduction sounds like a lot to take in. I'm not sure if I could comprehend the things that might have been said that day. So basically Gorons, I'm not exactly sure where to start with this part, so I'll just start with the humor and see where that ends up going. Despite Ocarina of Time's inherently serious and tragic premise, the game actually has quite a lot of funny and lighthearted moments. Personally, I think the humor is quite well done. There's a lot of pretty funny cutscenes in this game. Of course, when talking about humor, I can't not mention the hilarious plot point of how Princess Ruto considers Link her husband. Back in the child timeline, Link is asked by King Zora to rescue his daughter, Princess Ruto, from the third dungeon, inside Jabu Jabu's belly. Jabu Jabu is a godlike fish deity worshipped by the Zora, and inside of which there is a gigantic dungeon that Ruto has been going inside of ever since she was young. Again, I promise you, this is really important for the story. One day, she allegedly gets stuck in his belly, so Link goes to rescue her, but it turns out she wasn't actually stuck there, she just managed to lose a precious gem that she's now looking for, and thus insists that she doesn't need Link's help. Although Link of course attempts to assist her and rescue her in order to keep his promise to King Zora, which prompts Ruto to stubbornly sit down and demand Link carry her. Which he does. Fucking simp. Once Link clears out inside Jabu Jabu's belly, Ruto gives him the Zora Sapphire, claiming that this is a special gem that one only gives to their partner. Later in the adult timeline, when Link meets Ruto in the Water Temple, she claims that Link is her husband, and continues to do so even when she awakens as a sage, feeling sorry that she can't be there for him, even after 7 years of waiting for his return.
It's kinda tragic actually, now that I think about it. Well, it would be tragic if it wasn't for the absurdity of the whole situation, and how afraid Link is of committing to a relationship. This is how fatherless families are formed, you people. Another particular moment that comes to mind is when you play a song for Daruni and he starts doing this goofy-ass dance and then hugs Link in excitement. Or in the adult timeline, when all the Gorons are gone, save for one that you find in the Goron town near Death Mountain, and when talking to this remaining Goron, he explains that he's actually Darunia's son, and that his name is the same as the name you wrote when creating the save file, and that he's named after the brave hero who saved the Goron race by clearing out Udongo's cavern 7 years ago. If you named yourself Link, his name will also be Link. If you named yourself Shithead, his name will also be Shithead. That's definitely my favorite character in the game, Shithead the Goron. Well, okay, favorite after Ruto. Speaking of Gorons, I guess we should talk about the various races that inhabit Hyrule. Obviously you've got Hylians, but you also have Kokiri, Sheikahs, Gorons, Zoras, and the Gerudos. And the Deku Scrubs, but like, who gives a shit about those? Personally, I really enjoyed the uniqueness of the races and tribes seen in Ocarina of Time. A lot of media default to the quote-unquote standard races of elves, dwarves, giants, etc. And I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing. I mean, I personally really like those basic races, and so do a lot of people. There's a reason why they're super popular. But it's nice to see a piece of media try out something different. I mean, they're not super original. I mean, 3 of them are basically just elves. One is like cave people, one is basically just fish, and the last one is just feminists. But those superficial descriptions doesn't mean they're necessarily bad. Each of the tribes have their own traditions, customs, lifestyles and such, and they all feel like a natural part of the world, which is ultimately what's important. They contribute a lot to the atmosphere of the game with their presence, making the world feel more alive, well except for the Sheikahs, since they were nearly wiped out during the Hyrulean Civil War that took place before the events of the game, with Impa and Sheik being the only Sheikah in the game. I do think some design aspects of the species are really dumb though. For example, the Gorons live near Death Mountain and eat rocks and bombs, and they consist entirely of males. So like, how do they reproduce? This was actually a topic of discussion during the first Ocarina of Time stream that I did that was unfortunately lost, and I kinda forgot what we agreed on the answer to that question to be. So basically it's just, yeah, we have no idea what it is. Please Nintendo, we need to know how the Gorons reproduce. Do they undergo mitosis or something? Is it just gay sex? The same kinda goes for the Gerudos. These are pirates who live in the Gerudo Desert, and they consist entirely of females, save for one male who is born once every 100 years, and by the virtue of being a male, he is automatically crowned king. In Ocarina of Time, Ganondorf is this king of the Gerudos, which like, okay, he's not even fucking present in the desert at any point during the story, so Nabru just takes charge by, I don't know, being the biggest, loudest feminist in the land. Also, if the king is the only male, if he just bails from the desert or like dies or something, is the race just fucked? Like, what's plan B here? How do these guys even reproduce? Please Nintendo, we need to know if it's just lesbian sex. Well, apparently, according to this one gossip stone, the Gerudo, quote, sometimes come to Hyrule Castle town to look for boyfriends. Great guys, impeccable fucking logic. The Kokiri are also kind of a mystery. Apparently they were once Hylians, but during the first signs of a civilization developing, they decided to distance themselves from the rest of the world and lock themselves up in the Kokiri forest, which led to them permanently looking like children for some reason, and also now they can't leave the forest or they'll die. Like, what? Honestly, I'm more nitpicking here for the sake of comedy. Like, anything you deem an oversight can basically just be boiled down to magic, which, hey, we're in a fantasy setting, so that's a viable option. Although, I seriously don't get the Gerudos thing, who let these developers cook? Another thing I like is how each of the sages that awaken upon clearing a temple belong to each of the tribes in the game. Saria being a Kokiri, Darunia being a Goron, Ruto being a Zora, Nabru being a Gerudo, and Impa being a Sheikah. Rauru, a Hylian, is already awoken as a sage by the time Link enters the Sacred Realm, and the 7th sage shall remain a mystery for now. But don't worry, the last sage isn't a Deku Scrub. A cool bit of trivia is how all of the sages besides Impa and the mysterious 7th sage are actually named after the towns in Zelda 2. Or, well, since Ocarina of Time takes place before Zelda 2 in the timeline, technically the towns are named after the 7 sages, but like, you get the idea. And also there's Mido, who's... well, I'm not sure why he's named after one, but like, okay, whatever. The two Kasuto towns are the only towns that are never mentioned anywhere in the game, which I don't know why that's the case, but whatever. I must say, I do quite enjoy how all of the games in the series have been referenced in some way thus far, although the game obviously has a preference for Link's Awakening. And that's kind of it, really. Yeah, this section was kind of just an excuse to make jokes. I'll save talking about the characters themselves once we get to the story section of the video, but before that section, there's one more gameplay aspect that we should talk about, or rather three, and those would be...
Hello?
Welcome to GameStop. What are you getting?
A PS2 maybe?
This dude. Bro, get your big ass up to my store.
Sir, I don't think you can talk to a customer like that. What are you doing?
Now that I think about it, this should have probably gone under the gameplay section, but who cares. There are a total of 12 dungeons in this game, less than in A Link to the Past, which had 13 dungeons, and more than in Link's Awakening Deluxe, which had 8 main dungeons, plus a bonus collar dungeon and the final fight area, which I wouldn't really call a dungeon. These 12 dungeons are inside the Great Deku Tree, Dodongo's Cavern, inside Jabu Jabu's Belly, Bottom of the Well, Forest Temple, Fire Temple, Ice Cavern, Water Temple, Gerudo Valley, Spirit Temple, Shadow Temple, and finally Ganon's Castle. Did I say Gerudo Valley? I meant Gerudo Fortress, my bad. So how do the levels in Ocarina of Time fare? Unsurprisingly, they're really good. They're all very unique among one another, each sporting a unique color palette that doesn't let the dungeons feel too samey. Even the ones that may appear similar at first glance, such as inside the Great Deku Tree and the Forest Temple for instance, are actually quite a bit different. The shapes of the dungeons are often similar, with circular rooms connected by long corridors. I'm the kind of person who plays these games with my brain turned off, so I tend to get lost in dungeons quite often, and that's also the case in Ocarina of Time. Despite using the map, I actually found myself being confused and not knowing where to go during some of these, especially during the midpoint of the game's runtime. I thought inside the Great Deku Tree, Dodongo Cavern, Shadow Temple, Spirit Temple, and Ganon's Castle were the best dungeons in the game, but that's mostly due to their relative linearity. Getting through them is relatively straightforward, especially in the case of the Shadow Temple, which I thought was the best major temple of the game. I say major because I'd consider the Gerudo Fortress, which was my favorite part of the whole game, to be a more minor area, kinda like the Ice Cavern and the Bottom of the Well. Overall, I really like the aesthetic of the Shadow Temple. It's really interesting and depicts the horrible acts committed by the royal family of Hyrule in the past, showing how they weren't necessarily the good guys during the Hyrulean Civil War. Inside Jabu Jabu's Belly is an interesting stage with the whole carrying Ruto around the level, but sometimes it can be really annoying to get through certain areas, because you have to carry Ruto through the stage, and if you drop her in a room and then go to the next one, she gets unloaded and is put back to her starting position, making your ass have to go all the way back to the start of the level basically. She can also clip through the wall, which is what happened to me.
Ow. I'm inside of her. What the fuck? What happened? What? Oh my god. That is annoying.
Fortunately, I didn't get soft-locked because she just respawned back at the start, but still, it's a total pace breaker in my opinion. I'd say the midpoint of the game is also its low point. I think the Forest Temple is really good, save for the puzzle where you have to shoot these pictures with your bow and arrow. But then you have the Fire Temple, which is ginormous with its 5 big floors, which are filled with secrets, but getting to all of them can definitely get really confusing as you keep trying to access the top floors but to no avail. Then you have the Water Temple, which is unanimously agreed upon to be the worst stage in the whole game, and in fact, some people who would otherwise consider Ocarina of Time as the greatest game of all time don't because of this level. The gimmick of this level is that you have to raise and lower the water levels at specific points throughout the level by playing the ocarina. And on top of that, in order to be able to walk underwater, you have to open your inventory, select the iron boots, close your inventory, walk for 5 seconds, open your inventory, unequip the iron boots, realize you went to the wrong section, open the inventory, equip the iron boots, close the inventory, walk back to a different section, open the inventory, play the ocarina, walk out of the room, open the inventory, you get the point. Combine this with a gigantic vertical stage with a very confusing layout, and it's not difficult to figure out why this stage is considered the worst in the game. It just sucks. Not to mention, prior to clearing this one, you also have to get through the stupid ice cavern, which isn't really fun in itself. But hey, one bad stage, or hell, even multiple bad stages back to back even, don't make a game bad on their own. Also, there's this door at the end of the level that if you don't have a key for, you gotta go all the way back and explore the dungeon a ton more.
Please tell me this is the boss. Oh, I'm gonna scream. Oh. I have never been happier to see a 16 polygon object in my life. Holy shit.
Ultimately, I think the biggest gripe people have with the water temple is the fact that every time you want to do absolutely anything, you have to open your inventory, select the item you want to use, and then close the inventory and then use the item, and then select a different item, and etc. Luckily, the 3DS remake adds a 4th item slot and allows you to bind even the items like the iron boots to separate buttons, making the game's pacing a lot better overall on that version. And that's pretty much everything negative that I can think of. Honestly, I really enjoyed the themes of the dungeons. I like the spookiness of the forest temple, the rescue mission in the fire temple, the horrors you see in the shadow temple, as well as this horrifying monstrosity scene at the bottom of the well, the side quest with Naboru and the spirit temple in general, the way you get thrown in jail in Gerudo Fortress, like, I don't know why that's so funny to me. I just really like this game. Honestly, I think I like Link's Awakening more, but this game, you know, it's really fun. Its levels, themes, designs, it all blends really well together and they make up for a really enjoyable and charming experience. The game is just really atmospheric. So now that we're done talking about the dungeons themselves, there are 2 things left to talk about before moving on to the story section of the video, and those would be the items and the bosses. I don't want to focus on the items too much since they aren't really all that remarkable. If you've seen the items in A Link to the Past, then you can kind of expect a similar deal here. You have your hookshots, hammers, bow and arrows, spells, etc. But the items have a unique gimmick this time around, which I'd like to mention briefly. The items are split into 3 types in this game. One set of items is items that only young Link can use, another is items that only adult Link can use, and the third, of which there are very few, are items that both Links can use. Some items such as the slingshot or the Kokiri shield and sword are only accessible to young Link, and they get replaced by better equipment such as the bow and arrow, the Hylian shield, and the Master Sword. Adult Link can't use items which young Link uses like the bracelets or the Deku sticks because he's either outgrown them or found better alternatives, and young Link can't use the items obtained by adult Link such as the tunic and boots upgrades because Link obtained them in the future and therefore they haven't been acquired in the past yet, which I think is a nice bit of consistency. The mask side quest for young Link and the shading sequence for adult Link are also separated in this manner. And that's pretty much everything for the items. Like I said, I won't go too in-depth about them this time because they really aren't worth going in-depth about, and besides this video is getting extremely long as is. So let's quickly cover the bosses. Each boss in this game actually gets a subtitle along with their name, which I find to be super cool. I think many of them are pretty good, but some kind of, well, suck. I definitely don't think this is a Link's Awakening type of deal, where some bosses are just mega lame and some mini bosses are a lot more memorable. I think that all bosses in this game are great when it comes to the atmosphere. Each of them feels like they belong in the world they inhabit, and they each have an intro cutscene that is always super cool. They really executed these so well. To start things off, we have the parasitic armored arachnid, Goma, the boss of the Great Deku Tree. This guy is actually the same boss from all the way back in Zelda 1. Remember this giant one-eyed crab? This is him now. Feel old yet? Goma is pretty easy to deal with. You stun him with a slingshot, then attack him with your sword, or Deku sticks if you're a Chad, and then he'll climb on the ceiling and start spewing eggs at you. Then you wait for him to come back down, then rinse and repeat until he's dead. It's a pretty good introductory boss, nothing too crazy, nothing too difficult so far. The boss of Dodongo Cavern is, of course, Infernal Dinosaur King Dodongo, another boss from Zelda 1. He functions similar here to how he did in that game. You have to throw a bomb in his mouth, which will stagger him, allowing you to attack him. Although, when I was fighting this guy, I didn't even register that this was the same guy from Zelda 1 and that you can do that, so I was just running around the arena like a complete moron and I somehow managed to beat him. Bioelectric Anemone Baronade is the boss found in Jabu Jabu. It requires you to cut these tendrils that stick from the ceiling and connect to the boss with a boomerang, after which you have to stun the boss itself with a boomerang and then just attack it to death. And it only takes like 2 attack cycles to do this. Yeah, honestly pretty underwhelming, not gonna lie, but I guess that kinda goes for all of Jabu Jabu. Now the Forest Temple is where the bosses start to get good. Evil Spirit from Beyond, Phantom Ganon, is the boss of this temple. His introduction is actually a mirror of the encounter with Ganondorf right before obtaining the Ocarina of Time, which I think is super awesome. He charges from one painting in the room to another, and you're supposed to shoot him with a bow and arrow, after which you have to play a game of ping pong with his magical attacks until he dies. This fight actually reminds me of the A Link to the Past fight with Acclaim, with the whole Return to Sender thing, but amped up, and overall the fight is really cool and creative. After that, Subterranean Lava Dragon Volvagia doesn't only have one of the sickest names I've ever heard for a boss, but is also the boss of the Fire Temple, and honestly, I think she might be the hardest boss in the game. Maybe I just had a terrible experience fighting her.
She peeks her head from these pits located in her arena, which is when you're supposed to attack her with the hammer, not the Master Sword. But because of how laggy the animation for attacking with the hammer is, missing even once means you're winding yourself up to get hit. Also, when she rises fully out of these pits and starts chasing you around the arena is so terrifying, especially if you're low on health, and I love it. I swear, this game is almost like a horror game at times. For the water temple, we have giant aquatic amoeba, Morpha, which, fittingly, just like the rest of the water temple, also sucks ass. There's a giant weak point located inside of the boss at all times that moves around the room rapidly, but slows down after a while, which is when you can use the long shot to get the weak point on land, which is when you can whack it a few times before it gets back into the contaminated water. As for its only attack, it will grab Link, drain some of his health, and then throw him into spikes in the corner of the room. You can even see this attack in the promotional art for the game. Yeah, I don't know, I wouldn't say this boss is the worst thing in the world. I mean, it's definitely the worst boss in the game, but even then I don't think it's horrible, it's just kind of really underwhelming when compared to the rest of the game. And this game has Zelda 1 enemies as bosses, and they're much more interesting when compared to this one. Like, how do you fuck up so bad? Just not satisfying to fight or beat this guy. In fact, the only emotion I felt after beating this boss was relief, because the water temple was finally over. Moving on, we have the bosses of the Shadow Temple and the Spirit Temple, Phantom Shadow Beast Bongo Bongo, and the Sorcerer's Sisters Twin Rova. Bongo Bongo first. His fight takes place on what I can assume is a drum. You shoot his hands with arrows, which is when you have to use the lens of truth found at the bottom of the well to see his face, then shoot an arrow at his eye, which is when you can whack him a few times with the Master Sword. Repeat until dead. This guy's design is super creepy and very fitting for the Shadow Temple, and the fight is not too frustrating. Very well done, good boss. As for Twin Rova, these are actually two Gerudo witches who, believe it or not, are surrogate mothers of none other than Ganondorf. During your fight with them, they perform a Dragon Ball fusion and turn into Twin Rova, which then shoots out fire or ice-based attacks at Link. In order to attack them, you have to use the mirror shield found in the Spirit Temple, and then tank either 3 fire or ice attacks with it, which you can then reflect back at them, allowing you to get in a few hits. Repeat until dead. Honestly, I think this might actually be my favorite boss in the game, because it's a lot different from all the others, where this time you have to use the boss's attacks against them. Also, you get to see this jumping animation a lot, which I love. I won't cover mini-bosses here because they really are nothing special and they just reappear as normal enemies in later dungeons, although I would like to talk about 2 mini-bosses in particular. Can you guess which temples they're found in? Okay, you got me, one is in the Water Temple. And it's none other than Shadow Link from Zelda 2. People often have a problem with this fight because, you know, mirror fights suck, and also the 20 FPS really doesn't help this fight. But I don't know, I beat this one on my first try and I actually kinda liked it. I like the build up to it, the weird acrobatics that Shadow Link uses. I mean, I don't think the fight is super fun, but I didn't hate it, I guess. Though I think it's utterly ironic that both the worst boss and the worst mini-boss are in the worst dungeon. I'm sorry, Shadow Link, it looks like you can't win no matter the game you find yourself in. The other mini-boss is also from Zelda 2 and it's found in the Spirit Temple. Back in the child timeline, the Twin Rova sisters trapped Nabooru inside of an Iron Knuckle armor, so in the adult timeline, you fight said Iron Knuckle to free Nabooru. This fight is honestly really cool. The Iron Knuckle deals a ton of damage, but his attacks feel like they have so much weight to them and the animations are great. I was really impressed by this. There's one more boss that I want to briefly mention, but I wasn't sure if it was a boss or a mini-boss, though the wiki lists it as a mini-boss, and that's Dead Hand, found at the bottom of the well and in the Shadow Temple. Not gonna talk about him at all, I just want you to look at his design. This game is rated E for everyone, and that's everything regarding the bosses, I believe, which means there's one more thing to talk about, and it's the one you've all no doubt been waiting for.
Oh, don't do it. Oh, don't do it.
And thus, we finally reached the part of Ocarina of Time that people remember most fondly. The story. But what is it exactly about the story that makes people love it so much? Well, before we answer that, let's just quickly go over the story so far once again, just so that we're all up to speed on what's going on. After acquiring the Kokiri's Emerald, Link and Navi are instructed to head to Hyrule Castle, where they will meet up with the Princess of Destiny. Once Link meets Zelda and gets introduced to Ganondorf, Zelda instructs him to find the 3 spiritual stones, which they want to use together with the Ocarina of Time in order to open the Door of Time at the Temple of Time, in order to access the Sacred Realm, in order to protect the Triforce from Ganondorf's evil heart, and stop him from destroying Hyrule. Still following? Link learns his first song and where to head next from Impa,
and then he travels to Kakariko village, then to the foot of Death Mountain, and finds himself in Goron's city, where he befriends the city leader Darunia and clears out the Dongo's cavern, which is when Darunia rewards him for his courage with the Goron's ruby. And also he declares him and Link are now sworn brothers, which, like, you know, that's, fuck with that. Darunia directs Link towards Zora's domain, where he meets King Zora, who promises to give him Zora's sapphire in exchange for rescuing his daughter, Princess Ruto, from inside Jabu Jabu's belly, Jabu Jabu being a godlike fish deity whom the Zoras worship. Link finds Ruto inside of the fish's stomach and helps her retrieve a precious gem that she lost in there, which turns out to be Zora's sapphire. Once he gets rid of Jabu Jabu's stomachache, Link and Ruto find themselves back in Zora's domain, where Ruto gives Link Zora's sapphire as a thank you for rescuing her. She also says that this precious gem is something that one only gives to their partner, which, unbeknownst to young Link at the time, according to Zora tradition, means that they're now engaged. Okay, if you haven't figured out that this is important for the plot, I don't actually know what to tell you anymore, just please stop asking. During this time, he also meets Malon, a young girl who lives on Lon Lon Ranch and sings really beautifully. He also meets the ranch's horse, Epona, who grows to like Link over his brief stay on the ranch, and this horse will also become Link's companion in the future. He also finds the hidden truth about what happened during the imprisonment war that happened before the start of the game at the bottom of the well. With all 3 spiritual stones in hand, Link heads back to Hyrule Castle in order to talk to Zelda, but he finds her and Impa running away on a horse from Ganondorf, who turns to Link, asking him where the princess ran off to, only for Link to grab his trusty sword and point it at Ganondorf, who of course laughs in his face and blasts him with some magic attack, although he commends him for having the guts to stand up to him, then runs off into the distance. Before she left, Zelda threw something in the castle moat, so Link goes to check it out and finds the Ocarina of Time there. He then gets a vision on how to play the Song of Time, then proceeds to enter the Temple of Time and open the Door of Time using the Ocarina of Time to play the Song of Time. How many times have I said time in this fucking script? Oh my god. Beyond the door awaits the Blade of Evil's Bane, the Master Sword, the only weapon that can defeat Ganondorf according to Zelda. Link picks up the sword from the Pedestal of Time, which opens the entrance to the Sacred Realm. However, in a 537,000 IQ move, instead of following Princess Zelda, Ganondorf followed Link inside the Temple of Time and snuck into the Sacred Realm. Furthermore, while the Master Sword recognized Link as the Hero of Time, he was too young to be the Hero of Time, so it locked him inside of the Sacred Realm for 7 years, during which Hyrule had become completely transformed into an unrecognizable shadow of its former self by Ganondorf. Link's actions directly led to the near destruction of the entire world. Link then wakes up inside of the Sacred Realm 7 years later at the age of 16, now all grown up, and meets Rauru. Rauru says that he is the first of the 7 sages, and instructs Link to go out and find the other 6 sages by clearing out the dungeons of Hyrule. Before he sets out on his journey, he meets Sheik, a mysterious character who greets Link before and after each dungeon, and teaches him new songs to play on his ocarina. During his adventures, he awakens his old friends, Saria, Darunia, Ruto, Impa, and Naboru, with Naboru being someone whom Link meets in the Spirit Temple after he already woke up in the future, but by placing the Master Sword back in its pedestal, Link travels back in time and goes to the Spirit Temple, as instructed by Sheik, where he meets Naboru and helps her raid the Spirit Temple, but then she gets trapped inside of an Iron Knuckle armor by the Twin Rova sorceress, with Link having to rescue her in the future. And that's the story thus far. As you can see, the story is pretty simple, and on the surface, it doesn't seem super interesting or unique necessarily. But the thing about Ocarina of Time, when you look beyond that surface level, is that this is, in essence, a story about growing up. And not just about growing up, but facing the consequences of your actions. Link's childhood was an incredibly peaceful one, until the day it had to end. Until the day he had to become the Hero of Time. The world needed a hero, someone who would stop the evil heart of Ganondorf, and that person had to be precisely him. And not only that, but by following Zelda's instructions to protect the Triforce and the Sacred Realm, he inadvertently led Ganondorf to the Triforce, and thus the near death of the entire world itself. And now he has to go on this grueling journey, dealing with the mess he caused himself, in order to try and amend for the mistakes he made 7 years ago. You know, it may seem silly to you or me or anyone else nowadays, but there really was no game like this back in the day. A story so interesting, a plot twist so incredible, a narrative so deeply nostalgic. The whole of Ocarina of Time is just a beautiful tale, and once Link's journey is over, he must go back to his world, because when Ganondorf is stopped in this one, the time when he never got the Triforce will be in need of the Hero of Time. And thus, Ocarina of Time is a story about a boy without a fairy fighting an impossibly strong evil in order to save a world that will never remember him. And that is one deeply tragic, gut-punching tale, one that you probably wouldn't expect from a game that came out in 1998. And it is a crazy thing, because there really just wasn't anything like this back then. The game, funnily enough, really was ahead of its time, and so was the story of the game. And honestly, even though I joked about it earlier, I'm really surprised by the fact that this game got rated D for everyone. I mean, here in Europe it got rated as 12+, same as Majora's Mask, which got rated T14 in America, and I think it being rated as 12+ is more appropriate. Although, I suppose it being rated as E for everyone led to it being more popular than its T14 brother. What was I talking about again? Right, the story is really impactful and deeply tragic and yada yada, but of course, I have a degree in media literacy, which means that nothing is perfect and that I must poke at the story and try to find something, anything that sucks. And I'm sorry to admit it, but there isn't anything in the story that really sucks necessarily, although I guess there is one moment in the game that used to really bug me, and that's the moment when Link travels to the Spirit Temple. Here you need to travel back to the past in order to meet Naboru, and you have to get here as young Link by playing the Requiem of Spirit, because you can't actually get here as a kid normally. You have to tell her you work for Ganondorf, which will make her not believe you at all, and here you have to help her raid a part of the Spirit Temple, and then she'll get trapped by the Twin Roba Witches, and you have to free her in the future. The quote-unquote issue here is that Naboru is the only sage you don't meet as a child. I mean, technically you do, but the way you do was executed in a somewhat unnatural and inorganic way in my opinion. However, I think that this can actually be perfectly justified. If you're going for the 3 dungeons as youngling structure, then putting the Spirit Temple as a level in the child timeline before you get to it in the adult timeline would take away from the urgency of the situation and ruin the pacing. But by doing it this way, even though this is a youngling section, it feels like an adultling section. So the whole thing is justified, because otherwise we would have a serious pacing issue here. And that's much worse than what we got in the final game, so I think that's actually pretty okay. And honestly, that's the only thing I can say is wrong with the story, and even that is a nitpick. What can I say, this is just a well executed, finely crafted and beautifully written narrative. So how did the characters in this game hold up? Well, let's talk about them, starting with the famous plot twist of the game. Okay, if you've somehow managed to avoid spoilers for this game for 25 whole years, this is a spoiler I guess. So, if you're not aware, the final stage of the game is Zelda herself. After running away with Impa on a horse on that fabled day 7 years ago, she went into hiding and placed a spell upon herself which transformed her into Sheik, an androgynous Sheikah. Now, I say androgynous and not a male because... Okay, so I'll be very short with this digression, but I think I really have to make a few things clear. I refer to Sheik throughout the entire video as she, because I personally always thought that Sheik is female because Zelda is female, as stated by Bill Trinan, a professional Japanese to English translator for Nintendo and one who was an interpreter for Shigeru Miyamoto, in this interview around the release of Hyrule Warriors in 2014. I only learned later on that lots of people see Sheik as male, and I say see and not think because it's not entirely clear from the game whether Sheik is male or female. Ruto refers to Sheik as a man, but I honestly can't tell if this is Zelda's disguise being so good it legitimately managed to fool all of Hyrule, or the developers confirming that Sheik is a man. I mean, there's definitely the fact that Sheik uses magic to transform back into Zelda, but whether Sheik is male or female is a mystery. The voice we hear in the game during the Shadow Temple cutscene sounds pretty feminine in my opinion. But then again, Sheik has a more masculine appearance than a feminine one in the game, though in other non-canon works such as the Super Smash Bros. Series and in the aforementioned Hyrule Warriors, Sheik started looking more and more feminine with time, but then again, all of this is non-canon. That's the important part. I personally think that this is something I like to call the Darth Vader reveal. Everyone knows that Darth Vader is Anakin Skywalker, the father of the protagonist of the original trilogy of Star Wars, Luke Skywalker. But obviously this wasn't known until the big reveal in The Empire Strikes Back, so nobody calls him by his name in order to not spoil the surprise. In fact, Nintendo actually did this with another one of their series, and 12 years prior, Metroid, where Samus is referred to as a he in both the manual and the guidebooks at the time, precisely because they didn't want to spoil the ending of the game, where it's revealed that Samus is actually a woman. Personally, I think it's the same situation with Sheik here. Everything relating to the actual game refers to her as a man, because they just didn't want to spoil the surprise. But really, that's just my theory on the whole situation. I'm very much aware that there are people who like to headcanon Sheik as non-binary or trans or gender fluid. If it makes you like the game more, or if it makes you like the character more, then I think that's absolutely incredible. More power to you. But for some reason, people get seriously aggressive whenever this topic even gets brought up. And for that, I have to ask you to please stay civil in the comments. I know this is some thin ice I'm walking on here, but come on guys, it's a video game character. There is literally zero reason to send threats to people over their opinions. Like, this is YouTube, not Twitter. Anyways, Sheik is Zelda, yippee. But let's be real here, you probably already knew that. But you know who managed to avoid spoilers on this for 25 whole years? Me. And then I got spoiled on it right before I played the game, because I was playing Smash Ultimate with friends, and my friend asked me who the hell is Sheik, and I went to the Zelda wiki, and the first line says that Sheik is Zelda. It was a bruh moment. Anyways, I'll save talking about Zelda for the end of this segment, so let's just get into the other characters. When it comes to the other major characters, or, well, characters in general, this is one of Ocarina of Time's strongest suits in my opinion. The characters in this game are extremely memorable, even minor ones like Talon, Malon and Ingo. Although I think some characters in this game could have been executed a bit better, or some scenes with them at least. Like this scene with King Zora where he moves super slowly out of the way of the path you need to take, which is supposed to be comedic, but in reality it's just a minute-long unskippable cutscene of a fat guy moving from one side of his couch to the other, and it gets old after like 10 seconds. I also don't really like anything about Mido, whatever the fuck his name is. He's rude, he's mean, and he sucks in general. Fuck you, Mido. I'm sorry, I will never like this character. I don't care if I'm offending all 7 Mido fans out there, if there even are that many, but I don't like this guy, not a fan at all. Okay, to give credit where credit is due, Mido does actually have a character arc, which I think is really good. When you return to the Kokiri forest as an adult, he tells you can't pass through the forest temple, so you play him Saria's song, after which he realizes that you know Saria and lets you pass through. He also mentions how he trusts you and how you remind him of him, obviously referring to young Link and the times they spent as children. Then after completing the forest temple, Mido knows that Saria became the forest sage and that he will never see her again, and says how he made a promise to Saria that if Link ever came back, that he would tell him that Saria would be waiting for him because Saria really liked, and that if Link sees him somewhere to let him know, and also that he's sorry for being mean to him. This is a really bittersweet moment, and one that I kind of overlooked originally because I honestly really don't like Mido. Also, I checked just to make sure, his name really is pronounced Mido, not Maido. Apparently it's supposed to be pronounced the same as the word Midori, which means green in Japanese, but honestly just call him whatever you like. It doesn't really matter what the proper pronunciation is. But yeah, the fact he goes through a character arc is great. I just don't really like him too much. But this moment right here is quite good. The fact this dialogue here shows up only after you clear the forest temple is also really cool. It's so easily missable, but if you do actually go back and talk to Mido, you get quite a reward. On top of that, we get confirmation that Saria was actually in love with Link. I'm kind of torn on this revelation because on one hand, I very much like hetero-romance in media, but on the other hand, the relationship between Saria and Link always came across to me as just friends, with Link never reciprocating those same feelings that Saria apparently had. But then again, he is a silent protagonist, so I mean, what is he gonna do, say something? As for the sages, all of the 5 sages that you rescue throughout the campaign are great characters with distinct personalities. Rauro doesn't really fall into this category because, I mean, let's be real here, he has no real personality, he's just some old wizard guy, but everyone else is a joy to be around. Saria being a gentle and loving companion who reassures you throughout your journey, on top of being Link's only friend while growing up. Darunia with this stoic persona that gets cracked when you play a song that he likes, and the way he calls Link his brother after he helps him with clearing out the Dongo Cavern. Ruto with this hilarious plotline of her and Link essentially getting engaged, only for him to disappear for 7 years, with her never breaking her promise that they will one day meet again. Impa being a protector above all else, someone who is there for you even when you don't feel like she is. And Naboru, similarly to Impa, with her being deeply impressed by this one kid and his never-ending bravery and courage. And she's also thirsting for him, which is kind of weird to put in a children's game, but whatever, we'll let it slide. The thing that ties all of these characters together is that they are all your friends. In A Link to the Past, which, holy hell I mentioned that game a lot, the 7 maidens that you have to rescue from the dungeons aren't really people you know, not even Zelda really, and they also have no personality whatsoever and only serve to dump exposition onto the player. But here, these are the people that Link grew up with. Even if he wasn't present for 7 years, they are still his friends, and they are willing to put their lives on the line in order to help their friend out. And I think that's beautiful. You might have noticed that I've tried to refrain from saying you when referring to Link and try to call him Link instead as much as I could. This is because whenever I play this game, it really doesn't feel like I, the player, am the central protagonist of the story. but rather a character that I'm playing as is. That's right, despite not saying a single line throughout the entire game, I can say that Link is a great character. For the first time since the start of the series, I truly feel like Link is his own separate character, and that I'm experiencing his story. This is all thanks to the expressive animations and wonderful cutscenes present in the game. I've already talked about this in the gameplay segment, but I seriously love these little hops he does when fighting. He's so cool, always ready for action, never backing down from a fight, despite all the fear he feels, still persevering to the end. And well, that's what courage is. Courage is not a lack of fear, but rather choosing to move forward despite all the fear you feel in your heart. So yeah, I can safely say that the Hero of Time is an S-tier character, despite being a silent protagonist. I also really like Navi. As a gameplay mechanic, she's kinda annoying, and as a character, she doesn't really exist. But I like Navi because she's the only character that travels through time with Link. Navi has seen all the horrors the future has to offer, and despite everything, or maybe because of it, she sticks by Link's side throughout the entire journey, and I think that's damn beautiful for an annoying tutorial character. And I suppose that just leaves Sheik, and in turn Zelda. Zelda in her true form has maybe 5 minutes of screen time tops in the entirety of the game, but Sheik is a recurring character throughout the entire game. She greets you at the start of every temple, she teaches you songs, and is basically your only friend in the apocalyptic future, save for Navi. I like Sheik in this game. It's always a relief seeing her, and her interactions with Link are... well, I can't really describe the feeling I feel when these scenes are playing. It's just pure magic. And by the time you awaken the other sages and return to the Temple of Time, she's waiting there for you, finally revealing her true identity. And now that we're here, I mean, just look at this story. You've got engaging characters, a gripping narrative, a great plot twist, and above all else, the story is one that many people can easily resonate with and understand. You can see how this is something young children would find appealing, but the thing I like about the story is how it feels a lot like an animated movie. Sure, it's intended for children, but the adults in the audience can also enjoy it just as much, sometimes even more. Ocarina of Time's story is just really good, and it truly resonates deeply with a lot of people, myself included. You know, I bawled my eyes out the first time I got to the credits of Link's Awakening, but to be 100% clear with you, while I didn't cry when I got to the ending of Ocarina of Time, that's because I played the game on stream and was talking constantly. Had I played it by myself in silence, I definitely would have cried. The game is just that incredible. But, you know, it's not just the story being really sound and expertly written in general that makes it so enjoyable, but also everything else found within the game. It isn't just the story that tells the story, but the world around it as well. Seeing how the world changes and how the characters that inhabit it change along with it is something that makes the story so much more enjoyable than if it was just the adult timeline being slightly darker, like in the case of A Link to the Past. Seeing how the characters react to the new world tells so much without saying anything at all. The fact the Gorons are gone, the Zora King being frozen, Mido being sad that his friends are gone, it all speaks so much without saying anything. On top of that, the designs of the characters speak a lot about what they are supposed to be, with the Gorons clearly being these strong dudes that actually have a soft side to them, the Gerudos clearly being thieves with this jewelry that they don, the Kokiri having these very simple outfits that are all very similar to one another because the Deku Tree isn't really all that creative. All of that designed with a specific purpose in mind. Nothing in this game is random. Sure, some things may seem like it, but they're really just jokes put in by the developers. But everything in this game is built with a specific purpose in mind in order to make the world feel real. And I think that is best portrayed with the design of Ganondorf. This one image of Ganondorf tells you so much about the character without you having to ask about anything. If someone asks who is Ganondorf, this image is the best answer. A strong and physically well-built character design, but clearly not that of a dumb brute, but rather someone intelligent, cunning and evil, with the motif of a pig hidden within the design. Satoru Takizawa is the mastermind behind this design, and his depiction of a crooked and complex thief who is basically an all-around abominable human being, with a hint of parts where he is rather good, makes for an absolutely brilliant design for one of gaming's greatest villains. But even with all of that, I think my favorite thing about this game is definitely how people connect with their childhood through it. If you go on YouTube and listen to one of the songs from the OST, particularly the title theme, scroll down to the comments. There are always people there mentioning how much this game means to either them or people close to them. Often the comments have nothing to do with the song itself, but rather just the feelings they feel when they just think about this game. Do I feel the same way these people do? Well, not really, since I haven't played this game as a child, but I do feel this way in regards to other games I grew up with. And on top of that, I found Ocarina of Time to be incredibly enjoyable. I was rewatching my streams of the game to check some notes regarding certain gameplay mechanics, and I ended up seeing my reactions to the game as well. I was overly ecstatic in regards to pretty much everything regarding the game. Different plot points getting revealed, seeing how the developers crafted different aspects of this game, hell, the story as a whole. I just found all of it so enjoyable. I felt like a child playing through a game for the first time. And okay, maybe I did feel the same way as everyone else who played it when they were young. Ocarina of Time, for many people, is a peek at their younger days, and how much simpler times were back then, if not better. It's no coincidence that a game about traveling through time, back and forth between childhood and adulthood, is the one game that helps you connect with your childhood as an adult. To put it simply, even with its remake, even with all of the sequels that have come out since then, even with every game that has come out since its release, there will never be another game like Ocarina of Time ever again. One so whimsical, magical, and deeply nostalgic in its presentation, atmosphere, and everything else that makes the game what it is. To sum things up, Ocarina of Time, despite having such a simple premise, is a deeply entertaining game that kept my attention from beginning to end, and each day I was always excited to start up a stream and play the game for hours on end. It's just a truly thoughtfully designed and well-made game, from beginning to end. Of course, Ocarina of Time is not a perfect game. That never was the point during any part of this video. I also don't think it's the best game ever made either. And you might be saying, but isn't the title of the game the greatest game of all time? Yes, but the best and the greatest are not the same thing. The greatest games are those that reinvent the wheel and change how we think of video games as a medium, and what is possible to create in said medium, on top of being genuinely very fun. The Last of Us is a cinematic masterpiece, and a game that tells its story in a way that's almost movie-like, one of the first of its kind, and has influenced other developers to develop games similar to it. Games like Super Metroid and Castlevania Symphony of the Night gave birth to an entirely new genre, and so did games like Demon's Souls and Dark Souls. Difficult but rewarding and satisfying games that tell their story in a way never before seen in video games. Earthbound, despite being a commercial failure, is still influencing Western turn-based RPGs decades after its release, and thanks to it, we got something like Undertale, a game which has changed how we think of violence in video games. Then you've got something like Super Mario 64, which has been a staple of what 3D platformers should look like ever since its release, and Super Mario Bros. Saved the video game industry. Zelda 1 was a game that featured never-before-seen levels of exploration in video games, the blueprint for what the Zelda franchise would become, and A Link to the Past was that times 100, a game that to this day is seen as the very literal foundation of the Zelda series. And Ocarina of Time is the first game to feature mechanics seen in most 3D titles nowadays, and continues to inspire game developers to this very day, and as such, while it's not one of the best games anymore, because it has a lot of things holding it back, and at this point it is a really old game, it is most certainly one of the greatest games of all time. But is it really the greatest game of all time? Everything that we've talked about today has been pretty sound, and it all makes for a very good contender for the status of the GOAT. But there is one more thing left to talk about. The third act, the most important part of any story. How does the ending of Ocarina of Time play out? Well, there is only one way to find out.
There must be some misunderstanding. Let me get this straight. You and I are supposed to be lovers?
This is no time to get all shy.
You little vixen, I knew you were fibbing.
You actually think I'd hand over the jewel shards as a ransom to get you back?
Of course you would, because that's what a lover would do.
But we ain't lovers, and without love, the whole argument kinda falls apart.
Zelda starts spilling some information about what happened in the last 7 years. When Ganondorf got the Triforce, after it split into 3 pieces, he was granted the Triforce of Power, while the Triforce of Wisdom was granted to her, and the Triforce of Courage was granted to Link. Zelda also gives Link the Arrow of Light, previously known as the Silver Arrow, though they have the same function. They are the only things that can damage Ganondorf. With the other 6 sages awakened, you can now begin the process of sealing Ganondorf into the Sacred Realm, which is when Ganondorf suddenly seals Zelda inside the crystal, just like in A Link to the Past. In his own words, he was waiting these last 7 years for the day Zelda and Link would meet again, knowing full well that Zelda would let her guard down and reveal herself to him. Ganondorf then teleports the crystal to his castle, which means there is one final destination left to visit. Thus, you can finally enter and complete the final dungeon of the game, Ganon's Castle. Personally, I think this is the best final dungeon we've had thus far. In Zelda 1, 2 and A Link to the Past, the dungeons were insanely long and complicated to navigate through, though you can argue that's much less of a problem for A Link to the Past. And in Link's Awakening, there isn't really a final dungeon, because once you get through Turtle Rock, you pretty much just have to do the magnifying glass puzzle in the Windfish's egg, and you're already at the final boss. Throughout Ganon's castle, however, you have to go through 6 different segments, each only a few rooms long, and at the ends of which you fight some enemies and can then talk to a sage to ask them to take down one of the barriers protecting the staircase that leads to the top of the tower. Doing this for all 6 sages will open up the actual path, where you will again have to fight through some enemies on multiple floors, all the while this ominous sounding music is playing in the background that gets louder and louder the farther you climb. And then, once you step through the final door, it is revealed that Ganondorf was the one playing that organ the entire time. I'd like to take some time to talk about Ganondorf as both a character and a boss. You might have noticed how I didn't include him during my overviews of the characters and the bosses, and that's because I feel it's much more appropriate to talk about him here, at the end of Link's journey. Ganondorf is, without a doubt, my favorite character in this game, and honestly one of my favorite characters in all of fiction. Ignoring all of the other iterations of him and focusing on this game specifically, that is. So, what is it that makes Ganondorf such an effective villain? Well, it all goes back to this cutscene at the Temple of Time. This moment when Ganondorf sneaks into the Sacred Realm by tricking Link used to really bug me. Like, he just ran in the opposite direction of the temple, and I mean, during this encounter with Link in front of Hyrule Castle Town, he meets him for the first time. Like, he doesn't know who the Hero of Time is. For all he knows, this is just some random kid. But then I thought about this one random throwaway moment at Lake Hylia. Remember this part in Jabu Jabu when Link tells Ruto that King Zora sent him to rescue her? Well, the way King Zora found out that Ruto was stuck in Jabu Jabu, I promise you it's important for the plot, please stop asking, is because Link found a letter at the bottom of Lake Hylia written by Ruto asking him to help save her, and not to tell her father about it, which then Link shows to King Zora, who sends him to help his daughter. But when you talk to Ruto in the game, she has no idea what Link is talking about, saying how she never sent any letters and that she's not stuck there. So wait, who wrote that letter then? It was some kind of a third party, but who? Was it one of the Zoras? I mean, this is their princess. They wouldn't just forge a letter from her, right? Well, King Zora mentions how Jabu Jabu has been acting weirdly ever since Ganondorf showed up at Zora's domain. And you can probably see where this is going. The one who wrote the letter is actually Ganondorf. I mean, I can't be 100% sure that it was him, but I think the events that we see in the game line up with this theory pretty well. But we can take this theory even further. Back after completing the Dongo's Cavern, Darunia mentions how Ganondorf came and tried to take Goron's ruby by force, but when Darunia didn't want to give it up, Ganondorf cut off the Goron's primary food source by waking up the Dodongo lizard inside of the cave where they used to gather their flower bombs, and now the whole species is starving. I always thought this was kind of strange. I mean, he's the Gerudo king. He's by definition the greatest thief in the entire world and commands the world's best thieves. You're really telling me he couldn't just steal one damn gem? And the same with Ruto. Why would he forge that letter? Can't he just take Zora's sapphire from her? Well, there's one problem with that whole plan, and it's that Ganondorf cannot enter the Kokiri forest and take the Kokiri's emerald because he would turn into Astolfo, as mentioned by one of the Kokiris. But then again, he probably has some kind of telekinesis or something, he could probably steal it. But you know, there's one problem with all of that. I mean, sure, none of the 3 characters in possession of the Sacred Stones would give them away, because, you know, Ganondorf isn't exactly the most trustworthy individual, but he could theoretically still do something to steal all of that. But the problem is he can't steal the Ocarina of Time from Zelda, because if he did that, then literally the whole country would turn against him. And that's a bit too much, even for him. But while Ganondorf knows that he's not actually trustworthy, there is someone else who Zelda would give the Ocarina of Time because she does trust, and that person is the Hero of Time. So what Ganondorf does is he manipulates the narrative in such a way that would allow Link to acquire all of the Sacred Stones, because he is the Hero of Time and a trustworthy individual. But on top of that, because he is the Hero of Time, he's the one who has the power to lift the Master Sword and open the Sacred Realm. So what Ganondorf does is he writes that letter in Ruto's stead and poisons Jabu Jabu in order to get Link to save her so that she would give him Zora's Sapphire. He starves the Gorons so that when Link shows up to save them, Darunia gives him Goron's Ruby, and he even sends Goma to kill the Great Deku Tree so that it gives Link Kokiri's Emerald. Well, I can't confirm that last one, but at least I think that's the case. And then he chases Zelda, who throws Link the Ocarina of Time, and then because he doesn't know the Song of Time, he lets Link play it instead and sneaks into the Temple of Time and into the Sacred Realm. And then throughout each dungeon, every boss is either a minion of Ganondorf's or an ancient being that he had awoken in order to impede the Hero of Time's progress, in order to kill him. And if none of those work out, it doesn't matter because he'll just do it himself then. I really wasn't kidding when I said Ganondorf had a 300 IQ moment. And the best part of the entire thing is, this is never explicitly told to you at any point during the game. You're only given clues that make you think about, oh yeah, Ganondorf is the one doing all of this, but once it all clicks together like this, it makes the whole thing so much more impactful, because this guy is literally responsible for everything that happens in this entire game. He's literally responsible for everything that happens in Link's life. On top of that, Ganondorf in this game is absolutely terrifying, but not in the same way Agahnim was in A Link to the Past. Like, Agahnim is probably the worst part of that entire otherwise fantastic game. I mean, he's not awful or anything, but everything from his design being generic to his personality being the most run-of-the-mill 80s villain you've ever seen, just makes him come off as uninteresting. Like, even in the game, all he does throughout the entire narrative is harass women and attack children. And that, coupled with Ganon himself being hyped as the actual final boss, leaves his alter ego as just a meh character in general. In Ocarina of Time, however, that's not the case. Ganondorf is introduced very early on, as both a character and the main antagonist of the story, but we don't get to really see much of him throughout the game. Honestly, I don't think he's on screen for more than 10 minutes during the game's 90 minutes of cutscenes, but he doesn't need to be. From the little we've seen of him throughout the story so far, he's shown to be cunning, extremely intelligent, powerful, and above all else, mercilessly evil. Not in a cartoon character kind of way, but in a this person truly has a heart full of malice, and he will absolutely go to great lengths in order to achieve his goals and cause suffering kind of way. You don't need to see Ganondorf every 5 minutes to understand why he is a threat. You see what he is like, and you see what remains of the world once he obtained the Triforce of Power, and that's all you need to see. On top of that, in every scene that he's in, every cutscene save for the last one, every moment of gameplay, Ganondorf has this smug grimace on his face. When he's chasing Zelda and Impa, when he's bowing to the King of Hyrule, when he's towering over Link, and now at the end of the game, he still has that taunting grin. Throughout the last 7 years, Ganondorf had completely warped what this once beautiful land, with many different species and inhabitants, once was, and it turned it into a lifeless, hostile environment that will forever leave a mark on the world, both with his defeat and without it. Ganondorf is a monster, a total tyrant whose sole wishes to rule the world, and that is shown to us not by him being constantly present throughout the story, but simply by letting the player witness what became of the world during Link's absence. Him not being physically present for the majority of the story is genius, and because of it, the player can form an opinion on this character without him even being in the same room as them until the end of the game. Ganondorf is a vile, sick, wicked old Gerudo that must be stopped by any means necessary. And it all comes down to this, the very end. At least, that's what both Link and the player think. But for Ganondorf, this fight is meaningless. In his mind, he has already won. The damage he's caused is already enough, and now that Link is standing in front of him, it doesn't make a difference to him. You might be wondering, why didn't Ganondorf just seal both Link and Zelda and teleport them to himself during that last Temple of Time cutscene, since he clearly has the power to do so? I mean, he has the power of the Triforce after all. If he were to do that, he would win right there and then. But he doesn't do that, because he wants to see Link suffer. The hope he had just a few moments ago, thinking that this whole mess that was originally caused by him is finally coming to an end, taken away in an instant. The immeasurable amount of hope both Link and Zelda once had, completely gone. And now that Ganondorf is holding Zelda hostage, the only option is to actually fight the damn thing. This monster, responsible for the suffering and misery of so many people, the loss of so many lives, and the person who destroyed Link's childhood. It's why he plays this song during Link's ascent to the top of the tower. He's just toying with him, mocking him for even daring to think he can stop him. And yet, Link knows that confronting him is the only way forward. For any normal person, this would be enough to push them over the edge. They would give up. They wouldn't be able to do it. No matter how hard they would try, against an opponent like that, defeat is inevitable. And that is why Ganondorf is so smug all the time. He knows he's already won, and he's just a predator playing with his prey. This child is the one who's going to stop him? Yeah, right, what a joke. However, Ganondorf, with all of his 300 IQ moments, managed to overlook one crucial detail in his whole plan. This isn't just a mere child. This is the hero of time, and he isn't going to give up. Even if it kills him, he knows this monster must be stopped at all costs. And so, he picks up his sword, ready to fight. And thus begins the final fight of the game, the battle versus the great king of evil, Ganondorf. This is without a doubt the best boss in the game, if not because of the mechanics, then because of the spectacle and the meaning behind it all. The entire game has been leading up to this point. From the moment Link had that nightmare we saw at the start of the game for the first time, up until now, his entire life has been leading up to this very moment. His whole life has been wholly spent, unbeknownst to him, in preparation for this exact point in time. The fate of the whole world rests in Link's hands. As many viewers already know, Ocarina of Time is the game that divides the Zelda timeline into 3 separate branches. One of them, the Downfall timeline, happens as a result of Ganondorf obtaining all of the pieces of the Triforce. This timeline, which all of the games that came out prior to this one take place in, is a direct result of the Hero of Time failing, succumbing to Ganondorf's schemes, and we've seen what became of this land. In A Link to the Past, the Sacred Realm is nothing more than a shadow of its former self, a bleak, dark world, if you will, with anyone who steps foot inside of it getting trapped in a monstrous form for the rest of their days. And as for Ganondorf, he turns into his true form, a wild, uncontrollable, boar-like beast who can only be stopped by the next hero. But the damage in that world has already been done, and the hero of legend can only pick up the pieces of the broken vase and try to tape them back together, though it'll never be the same as it once was, with the hero of Hyrule being left in a barren wasteland, once known as the Kingdom of Hyrule. The Downfall timeline is a bleak, dark future, one that our hero of time knows must be prevented from happening. Despite being alone and scared, and a mere child, he knows that the whole world depends on his triumph. And so, as Ganondorf sends his magical attacks at him, he strikes at it with the Master Sword firmly in his hand, returning the attack back to sender. The sender replies with his own parry, and thus they exchange blows indirectly, waiting to see who is the first to fall. As Link falls, Ganondorf laughs in his face. And yet, Link stands back up, and they go at it yet again. Link falls once more, only to hear Ganondorf's mockery. And yet he still refuses to give up. This time he strikes with all of his might, with all of the courage he has in his heart, and Ganondorf is staggered. As if on cue, Link whips out his bow and his newly acquired arrows of light. He fires them at Ganondorf. Ganondorf falls to the ground. With only a few moments to spare, Link rushes over and strikes Ganondorf with the Master Sword, before Ganondorf rises back up. He, just like Link, refuses to give up. Both of them have come so far, neither of them can give up now. And yet, the longer the fight goes on, and the more Link refuses to give up in the face of this impossible task, the more dread Ganondorf feels. This kid, maybe he was mistaken. Could he really pull this off? And as Ganondorf loses himself in his thought, Link manages to hit him one final time. Ganondorf falls for good. Zelda is freed. They did it. But before they can celebrate, Ganondorf pulls one final trick on them, and the whole castle begins to collapse. Link and Zelda rush down multiple flights of stairs, running for their lives before the whole fortress crumbles on top of them, and they manage to escape. They look back as the whole castle falls in on itself. It's over. It's finally over. The 7-year-long war, it has finally come to an end? Except Ganondorf, just like Link, in the face of impossible circumstances, refuses to give up. The Master Sword, the one weapon that can defeat this monster, is knocked out of Link's hand. A wall of fire cuts off Zelda and the Master Sword, along with the rest of the world, from Link, Navi, and the newfound danger they face. And thus begins the true final boss of the game, Ganon. There is no subtitle accompanying the boss this time, as if the game is trying to tell you that this is exactly who you think it is. This is the end. This is the apocalypse. This is that which stands between men and the doom of all things. A monster unlike anything Link has ever seen before, terrifying and terrified. In a desperate attempt, in this current moment, it has only one goal: kill Link. This is the only moment in the game where if you turn to Navi, the all-knowing guide who has been pestering you throughout the entire game, asking her for help, she will tell you that she has no idea what to do. She has no idea what its weak point is. This monster appears to have no weakness, and on top of that, it hits like a truck. Zelda is powerless in this situation. She can do nothing but watch from the sides as Link gets tossed around like a punching bag. With each hit, she lets out a scream, scared, horrified at what she is witnessing. I keep going back to this, but imagine if this were any other person in this instance. Imagine if this were you, faced with an impossibly strong foe that looks like this, with the world already torn, destroyed, with nothing left to live for. Here, at the end of time, a clash between two opposing forces. Failure here means the end of the world. With this unstoppable force as one's opponent, anyone would surely break, give up, die trying. But not the hero of time. No, not Link. If Ganondorf is the unstoppable force, then he is the immovable object. He is that which stands between the end and the beginning. He alone is the one who will save the world. And that's when he notices it. Ganon's tail. That is his weak point. With no sword in hand, he gets creative. He baits Ganon's attacks and strikes at his tail with his hammer. Ganon screams. It's working, and the firewall begins to fall. Link reaches for the Master Sword. This is it. This is the end. He strikes Ganon again and again. Soon enough, the boar has no strength left to fight, and he falls like a beast ready to be slain by the hunter. And that's when Zelda finally strikes. As the 7th and final sage, she holds Ganon in place with her light, begging Link to strike one final time. It's over. It's finally, truly over. Ganondorf has been sealed inside the Sacred Realm. Finally, for the first time in the game, no longer having that smug look on his face. He lost, and Link won. He claims that one day he will be back, to exterminate Link's and Zelda's descendants. Will that turn out to be the truth? Only time will tell. As for Link, he wakes up in the Sacred Realm, with only Navi and Zelda, his two friends that have been there with him every step of the way. Link has sacrificed his childhood, his life to protect this land, and that doesn't go unacknowledged. Zelda thanks him for everything that he has done for her, Hyrule, and the world, eternally grateful for his sacrifice. But she knows what must be done, and begs Link to give her the Ocarina of Time, offering to send him back in time to his childhood. It's the least she can do. And so, Link gives her the Ocarina of Time, and she plays her lullaby one final time. We then get to see the credits, which feature this big dance party with all of the characters from the adult timeline, where we can see King Zora and Mido sad over the fact they'll never see Ruto, Saria, or Link again. We then see the 5 sages, Saria, Darunia, Ruto, Naboru, and Impa, overlooking the land of Hyrule from atop Death Mountain, as the credits begin to draw to a close. After Link's return to the child timeline, the timeline of the game splits further into the adult timeline, which is the timeline 7 years after the start of Ocarina of Time, where after Ganondorf's defeat and Link's return to his own time, the Kingdom of Hyrule begins to recover, only for Ganondorf to escape the Sacred Realm, leading to the people of Hyrule to plead to the gods for help, only for them to respond by sealing Hyrule and then flooding it, leading into the Wind Waker, and the child timeline, which is the timeline where Link has been sent back to 7 years into the past. This time, Link warns the King of Hyrule about Ganondorf, thus foiling Ganon's plans and never allowing him to rise to power, thwarting him from the start, with Ganondorf being sentenced to death, only for his execution to fail, leading to him being sealed inside of the Twilight Realm, and leading to the events of Twilight Princess. But more on all of that some other time. Trust me, we will get to it one day. Which leads us to the final scene of the game, where we see young Link return the Master Sword to the pedestal of time, where it sleeps dormant once more. And now, Link has grown up. He is his own person now, weaving his own fate and no longer in need of a guide. And thus, Navi, with her purpose fulfilled, leaves Link forever. With his quest complete, Link sets out in search of Navi, which leads us into Majora's Mask. But before he does so, Link goes to the only person in the whole world who would ever believe any of his stories of heroes, villains, tragedies, and growing up. And thus, he once again finds himself in Hyrule Castle Garden, standing in front of the Princess of Hyrule. And that concludes The Legend of Zelda, Ocarina of Time. And I mean, what else is there left to say about this game? I've been going on and on about it for over 2 hours at this point, and I still haven't covered everything in the game. And yeah, I know this video was a really long one, but honestly, if any game deserves it, I think it's this one. This game is an undeniable masterpiece, one that has had an impact on so many people's lives, and even over 25 years later, it still holds up extremely well in most of its aspects, and I think it does deserve to be regarded as one of the greatest games of all time. A story about sacrificing his childhood and innocence to save a world that will never remember him, all the while growing up and learning what it means to be an adult. Ocarina of Time is a truly masterfully crafted narrative and game, one that is still inspiring developers, writers, artists, and people in general to this day. I suppose in recent years it's becoming more and more difficult to argue that it is the GOAT, especially with more recent releases such as Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom, which actually, believe it or not, amount to a third of the franchise's total sold copies. And while I haven't yet played either of them, I can definitely understand why people are gravitating towards naming them as the GOATs, especially since Breath of the Wild is the game with the most perfect scores of any game ever. I suppose the Ocarina of Time legacy lives on through it, although now that some time has passed since the release of Tears of the Kingdom and the hype has died down, people are actually starting to call it rather disappointing, which I find pretty interesting. But I sincerely believe that Ocarina of Time deserves this title, not because of what the critics say or what the player base thinks, but because playing this game is genuinely like magic, and there is simply nothing quite like it out there. Of course, there are newer games that people will definitely say are better than it. I've already mentioned Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom, but on top of those two, there's plenty of other games that plenty of people consider to be the best, with lots of them falling under various different genres. But in the end, there's a good reason why you often hear that one of these other games, or Breath of the Wild, is the greatest of all time. It's because so many of them are universally enjoyable and, well, fun, which is what matters most in a game. But there's also a reason why Ocarina of Time specifically is considered even by people who prefer other titles over it as the objectively greatest game ever made. And it's not just because Nintendo fans like to glaze their favorite games. Not only has it revolutionized the gaming industry and forever changed how we think games should be, and not only is it a really fun game, but it's also because Ocarina of Time is like the Hyrule of the past seen in that game. Whenever you return to it, it is exactly the way you remember it being when you left. It's that safe haven that you can return to in times of trouble and need, one that will always be there to greet you with open arms, and remind you why you love video games in the first place. Hopefully this video turned out enjoyable to you and lived up to the heights of this game, if only for a little bit. If this video is your first time experiencing the game, then I hope I've managed to convince you why this is such an incredible game, and if it isn't your first time experiencing it, then I hope you've managed to relive moments of your childhood, when you would stay up for hours on end in front of your TV playing it on your N64, or maybe even on your 3DS, and that you were taken, even if for only a moment, back to when times were much simpler, for all of us. Back when you first experienced the tragic story of the boy without a fairy and his quest to grow up and become the hero of time and save the world. The magical tale full of life, emotion, and passion oozing out of it, one that will never be replicated again, because just like how there is only one hero of time, there will never be another game like Ocarina of Time ever again. And although I cannot objectively say that this game stands at the pinnacle of the gaming industry, because that's not something for me to decide, I can say what I personally think. Ocarina of Time is art. It is a piece of art that, as someone who obsesses over art and thinks about it basically all the time, can appreciate fully, and can see a team of passionate people behind the project who didn't care about delivering a product, but making a story, making something worthwhile, making true art. One that fills that spot inside every person's soul, that spot that craves that art. Therefore, I think that yes, The Legend of Zelda, Ocarina of Time, is the greatest video game of all time, that it always has been, and that it shall be forevermore. Not because its developers had the power to create a great game, or the wisdom to make an engaging game, but because they had the courage to make a unique one. And I suppose I'll find out just exactly how wrong that statement potentially is once I play Majora's Mask. I've heard quite a lot of good things about it over the years, and actually, I kinda lied in that opening segment of the video because I did play Majora's Mask at a friend's house when I was like 9 or 10 years old, but I remember absolutely nothing about it, so it'll still be a first time playthrough when I do play it. Speaking of playing Majora's Mask, as I said in the intro, I will be live streaming my playthrough of it on Twitch. Not sure when it's gonna be exactly, since I'm recording this bit on... well, it's June 29th right now, but I'm re-recording this part. I originally recorded it, I think, on March 26th, if I'm correct. I'm not sure, but yeah, I guess you can see how long this actually took to make. I've been making this for like 9 months at this point, I think it's 10 months. This has been in production since September, so yeah. So because I'm really terrible with schedules and I don't know when I'll actually be streaming it, I'll just put it up on the screen right now. That's the date. Mark it in your calendars if you're interested in stopping by and watching me save the world from a moon falling from the sky. And don't worry, the Majora's Mask video will come out one day. I just don't know when, because as you can see, I don't really have a schedule for these. I just kinda make videos whenever I want to. Sometimes I have the motivation and time to work on them. Sometimes I don't have either of those things. So hopefully you can excuse me for that. As you can see, these take a long time to make. I mean, this is a full-blown movie at this point, so sorry for no monthly videos or anything like that. But hey, at least you're getting yearly videos, I guess. Though you can expect the videos to be coming out on a more regular basis during the summer, since that's when I'll have a lot of free time to work on them. So this is the prime time to subscribe if you haven't already. Anyways, man, what a video. I know it's been a long time in the making, and even though I said it wasn't going to be 2.5 hours long, it still ended up being that long. Actually, I think it's maybe longer, maybe like 2 hours 40 minutes. I'm not exactly sure, because I'm like recording parts of this one at a time instead of everything in one sitting. But yeah, hopefully you don't mind that. I really hope this is the longest video I ever make, because I really don't want to have to edit something this big ever again. Editing this was a monstrously difficult task, but to be fair, I went way too in-depth about the game for a normal human being, so hopefully there won't be another video that's this long. At least not until we get to something like Breath of the Wild. I can already tell that that one is gonna be over 3 hours. Anyways, while I said I don't really have a schedule for these, I do have in mind some videos that I'm 99% sure will come out during the summer. Or before October at the very least. First of all, in a week or so I'll probably be releasing the Ocarina of Time Akira Himekawa manga review, and after that I might release some videos on random topics or games or something. I've mentioned this in the update video as well, but I'll definitely be reviewing all of the mainline Zelda games. All 20 of them. And this year, you can expect at least the reviews on Majora's Mask and Oracles of Seasons and Ages games. There's a lot of stuff that's happened during my absence. Ocarina of Time turned 25 years old. Happy birthday, I guess. There was a Link's Awakening PC port that was anonymously uploaded to itch.io and taken down in less than 24 hours. Yuzu and Citra got shut down. We got confirmation that the Zelda movie is in production. Yeah, I've been gone for that long. Yeah, there was a Nintendo Direct like 2 weeks ago, and it announced this new game called Echoes of Wisdom, which, you know, I think it looks cool, but hopefully it's a spin-off game, because if a canon version of Link fell into a fucking hole and died, then he's the biggest bum in the universe, like, holy shit. Also, Four Swords is on the Switch. No, this is not a drill, this is real. Four Swords is on the Switch. And, Tears of the Kingdom amiibos dropped, I guess? I don't know, let's just get into the shoutouts. There's that one animation of Link, Zelda, and Ganondorf with the voiceover from Inuyasha, which was made by Flippin' Ding-Dong on Twitter. He makes some seriously cool stuff, and you should definitely go check him out. And I'd also like to thank everyone who joined the Ocarina of Time streams. You all made the experience super enjoyable, and I'm thankful that you decided to take the time out of your day to come and watch me play through the game. I'd like to give special thanks to the Deeth, Cyberdemon667, Pike, and Spamcan or Can of Spam 12. Thank you all so much for being a part of the journey with me. Spamcan and I have been talking a lot these past 9 months as well, and he's a great guy. He made these 2 graphics that I used for the video, and personally, I really like them. I think they're really funny. He even helped with the upcoming manga video by donating $5 so I can buy the manga because, I was broke. Sorry about those $5, man. I know you don't want them back and that you don't want anything in exchange for them, but at least you saw the almost final version of the video a month before it went live on the channel, so stand proud. You're the first sponsor of this channel. Making this video has actually made me go insane. To wrap this video up, I'd just like to thank you for sticking with the channel and anticipating this video so much. It's a true honor to be a creator whose work people look forward to seeing, and I'm eternally grateful for all the support you've all given me. Thank you so much for everything. It really does mean the world to me. If you've enjoyed the video, feel free to leave a like and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, and if you want to help the video reach more people, leave a comment down below. Why do you like Ocarina of Time, and what makes it so special to you? Do you think that it deserves to be called the greatest video game of all time? Please let me know down below. All of the Twitch VODs have been saved to a playlist on the channel. It's called Past Live Streams or something, but yeah. So feel free to join for the Majora's Mask streams. Follow me on Twitter, follow me on wherever the fuck. And that concludes the video. This has been a review of The Legend of Zelda, Ocarina of Time. Thank you for watching, and I will hopefully see you next time. Now, if you'll excuse me, I really need to go sleep.